Hello, everyone. Good evening. Tonight, I bring you a promised stream on the fate of empires and the search for survival. A article by the one and only John Bagot Glubb. I'm very lucky to be joined by the Politicrat for the first time on this channel. How are you?
I'm doing well, and yourself? Thank you for having me on. And I want to apologize up front for bailing at the last minute. Back on Saturday, I had something going on that I completely forgot and double booked. So
No, that's all right. Real life gets in the way. So what matters is we're here now, and so okay.
Yeah.
So those of people who watch my channel obviously know that I find John Bagot Glubb a fascinating individual. Indeed, I did actually do a video almost coming up to a year now, reading and commenting on his 1967 pamphlet, The Middle East Crisis. Well, we're sort of going to do that tonight, but in a more back and forth form with Politicrat, as we're going to read through the Fate of Empires and Search for Survival. It's only a 26-page article, so it's not terribly long. Even though it's quite short, is actually probably one of Glubb's most famous pieces of writing, because he throws his hat into the ring of cyclical history along with people like Arnold Toynbee, Oswald Spengler, and someone from the Arab world that Glubb would have been very familiar with, Ibn Khaldun.
Yep.
So interesting, because you actually have a video yourself on your own channel on Politicrat. So why didn't you sort of tell us, or how did you sort of discover Glubb or get into reading about him?
So this goes back to about 2017 or so. I remember I discovered a documentary. It was a documentary. I think it was like an independent documentary. I didn't agree with necessarily all of it, but it was essentially a critique of neoclassical economics, and it ended up advocating for a return to the sort of classical economics. It was an interesting argument, but long story short, there was, I think what was the documentary called? I think it was called like The Four Horsemen or something. It was about economic decline, and there was about a 5-6 minute segment on John Bagot Glubb and the decline of empires. I was like, this is an interesting thesis. So I ended up looking it up and I read it, and immediately it inspired me to start reading more into I guess it's almost like a genre, the sort of 20th century declinist history genre. I guess that's the best way to put it. So that led me to people like Spengler and Toynbee. And I remember by the time of the pandemic, I ended up, reading all that stuff pretty much took up all my time. I started writing sort of like a book or a study of my own. I haven't written it in years. Maybe it's something I'll go back to at some point, but not really a focus of mine. But when I started my channel, I figured, hey, this would be a good thing to make a video about, like a long form documentary. Because I mean, there are on YouTube quite a few videos about it, but there was nothing really comprehensive, or it was mostly just live streams and podcasts and that sort of thing. So I figured, why not make a video that's sort of like a crash course into these ideas? Figured it would probably be a lot simpler to do than do something on Spengler, which would take a lot more time. Same with Toynbee. The plan was to ultimately make it sort of a series that focuses on like all these declinist thinkers. I ended up doing a sort of follow-up, another one of that series on the Course of Empire paintings by Thomas Cole. And I wrote a script and started recording a similar one that focused on Samuel Huntington, which I have not released. I haven't worked on that in about a year. Again, time kind of got the better of me there. Might go back to it at some point, but yeah, I mean, that's my sort of, I guess, background in terms of knowledge on this subject. And I remember, Jay Burden, right?
Oh yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I went on Jay Burden about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, and we had a very similar conversation, just mostly on Glubb and just cycles of history, that sort of thing. So I guess this is probably, in terms of like my historical knowledge, this is my area of expertise. I am not a trained historian, but again, I mean, the best historians are often not the ones that are trained in academia. Not that I'm calling myself a particularly brilliant historian, but this is definitely my area of like specialization, so to speak. So.
Oh, well, thank you. And no, that's all right. I find if you go through the academy, you tend to be tainted by ideology. So probably better that you're not in some respects. So let's not say that not all academic historians aren't worth their salt. So yeah, so let me just bring up the Fate of Empires and we'll start reading through it. So okay. Okay. Can you see that fine?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so the Fate of Empires
Text is kind of small, but
okay.
Yeah.
Hang on, let me see if I can try.
Oh, I just full screened it, so I can see it better now.
Okay, good. Okay, right. So at the beginning here, we've just got a little introduction. So John Bagot Glubb was born in 1897. His father being a regular officer in the Royal Engineers. At the age of 4, he left England for Mauritius, where his father was posted for a 3-year tour of duty. At the age of 10, he was sent to school for a year in Switzerland. These useful travels may have opened his mind to outside world at an early age. He entered the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich in September 1914 and was commissioned in the Royal Engineers in April 1915. He served throughout the First World War in France and Belgium, being wounded 3 times and awarded the Military Cross. In 1920, he volunteered for service in Iraq as a regular officer, but in 1926 resigned his commission and accepted an administrative post under the Iraq government. In 1930, however, he signed a contract to serve the Transjordan government, now Jordan. From 1939 to 1956, he commanded the famous Jordan Arab Legion, which is in reality the Jordan Army. Since his retirement, he has published 17 books, chiefly on the Middle East, and has lectured widely in Britain, the United States, and Europe. So, as you see, so Glubb is a man with a very long storied military career, predominantly in the Middle East, and mentioning all his books there, the vast majority of his written word is on the Middle East, so either the sort of various military campaigns while he was alive, or a lot of the empires of the past. So I know in your video, Politicrat, you mentioned you've got his Great Arab History, the Great Arab Conquests, the Empire of the Arabs, the Course of Empire, and then also afterwards you've got the Lost Century, so covering this grand span of sort of Arabic stroke Islamic history. And it's a great work. And it's interesting if you read that, as Glubb's writing this after being in his retirement before writing Fate of Empires in the 1960s, you see the germination of a lot of the thoughts that would become the Fate of Empires bleeding through in those books. And as we'll get into, we'll see that come through. So, introduction. So, as we pass through life, we learn by experience. We look back on our behavior when we were young, think how foolish we were. In the same way, our family, our community, and our town endeavour to avoid the mistakes made by our predecessors. The experiences of the human race have been recorded in more or less detail for some 4,000 years. If we attempt to study such a period of time in as many countries as possible, we seem to discover the same patterns constantly repeated under widely differing conditions of climate, culture, and religion. Surely, we ask ourselves, if we studied calmly and impartially the history of human institutions and development over these 4,000 years, should we not reach conclusions which would assist to solve our problems today? For everything that is occurring around us has happened again and before. No such conception ever appears to have entered into the minds of our historians. In general, historical teaching in schools is limited to the small island. We endlessly mull over the Tudors and the Stuarts, the Battle of Crecy and Guy Fawkes. Perhaps this narrowness is due to our examination system, which necessitates the careful definition of a syllabus which all children must observe. I remember once visiting a school for mentally handicapped children. Our children do not have to take examinations, the headmaster told me, and so we are able to teach them things which will be really useful to them in life. I think that's an amazing quote. That's such a great summation of the British education system.
It's a very, very powerful intro, and I like how succinct he is. I can't say that I am necessarily the same in my writing, but what's funny is he basically said in 3-4 paragraphs what Spengler said in an entire 20-page chapter.
Yeah, that's one benefit of the Fate of Empires. It's a way to get into cyclical history if you've haven't got hours and hours to read through Decline of the West.
It's a fantastic entry point. Yeah.
I will say, and again, there's something really interesting because there's something broadly hierarchical with this idea that at a special needs school, you don't learn normal academic education, but you only learn the useful stuff. And now there's some people who would clutch their pearls and say, oh, but that's anti-egalitarian. Everybody's equal. Everybody's capable of the same level of learning. And it's like, no, they're not. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think people, I think people who are geniuses or academically gifted, of course, should go to university and have a conventional academic education, but that form of education is not suitable for everyone.
Yeah, precisely.
Okay, and just to carry on, so however this may be, the thesis which I wish to propound is that priceless lessons could be learned if the history of the past 4,000 years could be thoroughly and impartially studied. In these 2 articles, which first appeared in Blackwood's magazine, I've attempted briefly to sketch some of the kinds of lessons which I believe we could learn. My plea is that history should be the history of the human race, not of one small country or period. Okay, and how we have the fate of empires proper. So throughout, and we'll see he's broken it up into these smaller sections, which make it nice and digestible. So, one, learning from history. The only thing we learn from history, it has been said, is that men never learn from history. A sweeping generalization, perhaps but one which the chaos in the world today goes far to confirm. What then can be the reason why, in a society which claims to probe every problem, the bases of history are still so completely unknown? Several reasons for the futility of our historical studies may be suggested. First, our historical work is limited to short periods, the history of our own country, or that of some past age, which for some reason we hold in respect. Second, even in these short periods, the slants we give to our narrative is governed by our own vanity rather than by objectivity. If we are considering the history of our own country, we write at length of the periods when our ancestors were prosperous and victorious, but we pass quickly over their shortcomings or their defeats. Our people are represented as patriotic heroes, their enemies as grasping imperialists or subversive rebels. That just reminds me, have you seen that meme that goes round, and it's like you've got like the country with the castle and then the fleet, and it's our wonderful homeland, our glorious heroes, and then the other side it's like they're evil invaders, they're disgusting empire. Do you know what I mean?
What I find hilarious is how public opinion towards the legacy of the British Empire is significantly lower in the UK compared to Ghana, or in like a countries like Ghana and Nigeria. Like public opinion towards the legacy of the British Empire is actually way more positive.
Well, that is fascinating. It's funny if you say that, because recently I was making my way through Academic Agent's series where he's watching all the Adam Curtis documentaries, and in Pandora's Box, the final one deals with Ghana in the 50s and 60s, around the time they became independent, and it's just like so tragic how Kwame Nkrumah, the first sort of independent leader of Ghana, had all these grand ambitions, and he just completely like wrecked the country, and it all went to shit basically not long after independence. And so perhaps that's why they're thinking, oh no, independence was a mistake, we must return to the glory days of the British Empire.
Yeah, the issue with decolonization especially is there's nothing inherently wrong with decolonization. However, the way in which it was handled by most European powers, I'd say Britain handled it, comparatively speaking, the best. But it just happened way too fast.
And yeah, though I'm a bit more negative, but mainly it's because after watching Apostolic Majesty's video on Rhodesia, I'm become far more critical of how my government handled decolonization.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean.
Certainly not the British government's finest hour, that.
And I did find it, I know he's not prime minister anymore, but there's just something so ironic about an Indian being prime minister, rising to be prime minister at like about 2 years ago with Sunak.
I mean, I would laugh, but in reality, it makes one burst into tears because of how tragic it is. So.
Yeah.
So quite a comment from Caravaggio. History in British schools is geared around being taught we should hate ourselves. Yeah. I mean, all I would say is when I went through it, it was not probably quite as bad as it was now. Though I think I was probably starting to get the very beginnings of it, because I did Indian independence on my A levels, and it's just so like comically wrong, because it just presents it all. Gandhi and the INC were like they were Democrat, they were popular, bottom up revolution and change against the evil hierarchical British Empire. But when you delve into the truth, that's just a complete fantasy.
It wasn't even particularly hierarchical. Like, I mean, most of the provinces and colonies had, even in the Americas in the 1700s, the 13 colonies had way more autonomy compared to, for example, the Spanish colonies, which was definitely more of a sort of neo-feudal structure with very little social mobility, and governance was not put into the hands of the colonists, even to a minor degree.
Oh, no, thank you. And Namiel Carlson, the Soviet Union managed to sell 12 snowplows to the government of Ghana. Colonialist or not, the British would never have let that happen. Yeah, Adam Curtis does mention it in that documentary. That's just so laughable. But moving on. So, okay. Right, so third in the sphere of world history, we study certain short, usually unconnected periods which fashion at certain epochs have made popular. Greece 500 years before Christ and the Roman Republic and early Roman Empire are cases in point. The intervals between the great periods are neglected. Recently, Greece and Rome have become largely discredited, and history tends to become increasingly the parochial history of our own countries. To derive any useful instruction from history, it seems to me essential first of all to grasp the principle that history, to be meaningful, must be the history of the human race. The history is a continuous process, gradually developing, changing, and turning back, but in general moving forward in a single mighty stream. Any useful lessons to be derived must be learned by the study of the whole flow of human development, not by the selection of short periods here and there in one country or another. Every age and culture is derived from its predecessors, adds some contribution of its own, and passes it on its successors. If we boycott various periods of history, the origins of the new cultures which succeeded them cannot be explained. And that's something that's actually quite consistent throughout all of the different cyclical historians. So like Toynbee, Spengler, really, that they cover many different cultures and civilizations throughout the breadth of human history. The only really cyclical thinker who I'd say he probably is a bit more parochial or narrow focused is Ibn Khaldun, being an Arab scholar. He largely focused on the Arabic world in the Middle East, understandably so.
Yeah, and what I like about Glub is that it's almost complementary to Spengler in the sense where they're not competing theories, but you can easily, and I said this in the documentary that I made, you can very easily fit Glub's thesis within a Spenglerian or Toynbeean framework, because it specifically focuses on the life cycle of empires within that broader civilizational cycle. And as we can identify, and I think when Glub is discussing empires, it's best specifically to relegate that sort of the life cycle to like later empires that form within a civilization's lifespan, sort of like beginning prior to that sort of transitionary period that Spengler talks about from culture to civilization. For instance, I don't think that Glub's thesis can really be applied to something like the Holy Roman Empire or like the Parthians or something like that. But definitely the more developed great powers that come about later in a civilization's life.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with you because because in Spengler you've got the culture and then civilization. Civilization is this rationalist transition, and with Glub, when you look at he's got about 6 different phases, you can almost say that maybe there's a bit of overlap. Perhaps the early stages of empire are the tail ends of the summer or autumn period, and then when you get to like the mid-later periods, you're in proper winter then.
Yeah, like I'd say within the sort of Western Faustian quote unquote civilization, which really begins of course with Christian Western Europe prior to Charlemagne. With that, I think the first Western empire that you could really apply this Glub's framework to would be like the Portuguese. Start with the rise of the Portuguese and Henry the Navigator in the mid 15th century. And then, of course, you get the Spanish and then the Dutch and the French and eventually the British. So,
No, I more or less agree with that. But let's carry on. So, physical science has expanded its knowledge by building on the work of its predecessors, by making millions of careful experiments, the results of which are meticulously recorded. Such methods have not yet been employed in the study of world history. Our piecemeal historical work is still mainly dominated by emotion and prejudice. Now, this is interesting because Glub is proclaiming to represent sort of empiricism, as it were. I'm going to employ the scientific method to history. And it's interesting because Toynbee does that as well. Toynbee's very much this idea of, British empiricism. I'm going to be, rationally informed in how I project and look at history, which seems
Yeah,
quite.
like cause and effect, mostly based on causality. Whereas like someone like Spengler, totally different framework. Whereas like somebody like Spengler, a very organicist view, as opposed to Toynbee, who's definitely viewed civilizations more like complex systems as opposed to biological superorganisms.
No, certainly, and yeah. So Part 2, the lives of empires. If we desire to ascertain the laws which govern the rise and fall of empires, the obvious course is to investigate the imperial experiments recorded in history and to endeavour to deduce from them any lessons which seem to be applicable to them all. The word empire, by association with the British Empire, is visualised by some people as an organisation consisting of a home country in Europe and colonies in other continents. In this essay, the term empire is used to signify a great power, often called today a superpower. Most of the empires in history have been large land blocks, almost without overseas possessions. We possess a considerable amount of information on many empires recorded in history, of their vicissitudes and the lengths of their lives, for example. And then he's got a long table here with many empires throughout history. So we've got the Assyria, Persia, and that's the Achaemenid Persian Empire, ancient Greece. He then breaks the Romans down into the Roman Republic and Roman Empire, which is an interesting distinction. He's then got the Arabs, the Mamluks, the Ottoman Empire, Spain, Romanov Russia, and then the British Empire. And just to sort of critique some of this, so
yeah, I agree. I do have my fair share of critiques of this particular dating too, but of course you give yours first.
Okay, so with Assyria, so he's got 859 to 612. Well, in Assyrian history, there's 3 states. You have the old Assyrian Empire, old Assyrian Kingdom, the Middle Assyrian Kingdom, and then you have the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So Glubb here is specifically referring to the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which is when Assyria was at the height of its power. So he's chosen 612 as the end date, which is fine because that's the fall of Ninwa, which was the capital, and the empire ceased to exist, so that's fine. He's chosen 859 as the start date. Traditionally, the Neo-Assyrian period starts a little bit earlier, about the 10th century, but I guess he's sort of done this because in his model of empires, he says that all empires last about 200 to 250 years. So by picking 859, I imagine that's probably the beginning reign of some monarch. And then he's done it that way to benefit his model, which I suppose I'm fine with, though it's not 100% accurate, but, I can nitpick.
Like personally, when you're looking at so I guess sort of in my view, I would separate like the like Mesopotamian civilization into 2 separate entities: the Sumerians and Akkadians. That collapses, of course, with the Neo-Sumerian Empire around 2000 BC. And then I'd say there's sort of a new cycle, a new civilization that emerges with Babylon and Assyria, and I'd even incorporate Persia in there as well. And then, of course, the Canaanites and the Israelites in that particular cycle. So I'd say like the old Babylonian Empire and the old Assyrian Empire, in this case, it wouldn't really fit Glubb's model because organizationally speaking, far closer to something like the Holy Roman Empire or more of a confederation that pledges loyalty to a single king. So I guess those would be more equivalent to sort of early European medieval powers in the sense. So I generally agree with him starting, like if we were to put it within the context of sort of the Assyrian Babylonian civilization, Assyria does make sense for that lifespan. But the issue I really take, because a lot of his dates seem particularly arbitrary, which again, I do mention in the documentary I made, the Roman Empire, I'd say 180 is way too early to signify when it collapsed. However, I would definitely say that the age of decadence, which was the 6th age, definitely began in 180, but that definitely wasn't when the Roman Empire collapsed. I would say when you're referring to the Roman Empire, I mean, the Eastern Roman Empire, of course, I would say its own thing entirely, but I would say 395 would probably be a better date to signify the end of the Roman Empire with the division, because by that point, the Western Roman Empire really kind of became just an empire in name only, with a bunch of generals and warlords by that time. And even so, it definitely seems like he's trying to shoehorn certain things to fit into his model. but even so, those empires that last more than 250 years, even if you were still to average all these empires up and were to change the dates, they'd still average out to about 250. Like I remember I did like an entire calculation of that. And I think it came out to about like 247 or so, 247.3, I think. It's been a while since I ended up doing the math on that, but I'd say Glubb with his assertion is still correct. However, again, there are definitely errors to his dating.
Yeah, just to try and strongman him or steelman him a little bit. So with the Empire ending at 180, I know why I picked that date because that's the death of Marcus Aurelius, the last of the
Commodus,
five good emperors. Though, I mean, if his idea is up to 250 years, I don't know why he can't extend that a bit further and go to, the 230s when you have the crisis of the 3rd century, because that was really where things started going quite badly wrong. Because even though you had Commodus come in after Marcus Aurelius, Commodus is then deposed, and you have the Severan dynasty, and the Severan dynasty kept things ticking over for a good few decades. So,
and very similar to like the wintertime period, I think the age of decadence, there is no really, both with the age of pioneers and the age of decadence, there's really no hard set limit to when that begins and when that ends. So like similar to Spengler's wintertime concept, that's very similar to the age of decadence, where there's where it can take the collapse ultimately can happen fast, or it can happen very gradually and slowly, which I think would be the case with the Roman Empire. And I definitely would change it so that like Marcus Aurelius, I think he very much, and don't get me wrong, like this isn't, is I know the age of intellect, he uses it in a more of a negative way. And I'm not hating on Marcus Aurelius, but I think he definitely sort of embodies the spirit of the age of intellect if you were to apply it to the Roman Empire.
Although certainly, because there's this idea that Marcus Aurelius is Plato's philosopher king. He literally wrote some meditations, a book on Stoicism. So, yeah, I would agree with that. And it's interesting because going back to Toynbee again, Toynbee's got this wonderful phrase about the late Roman Empire, and he calls he's actually a bit more pessimistic of the Roman Empire than Glubb is, because he's got this concept that the 5 good emperors is often heralded as a great time. It's the Pax Romanitas, this great Roman peace. And he says, well, this was really the Indian summer of Rome.
Yeah.
He says the society hadn't really grown. It was very much stagnating. The only reason things seemed well is because you had competent rulers. As soon as they went, things started going wrong.
Yeah.
And just a critic.
No, absolutely. I was going to add that on as well, but yeah, you took the words out of my mouth.
Well, great minds think alike, as the saying goes. But just a couple of other dates I want to critique here. So he's got the Mamluks here, 1250 to 517. Well, that's the exact dates. The state is created in 1250 after the destruction of the Ayyubid Sultanate, and then it ends in 1517 with the conquest by the Ottomans. So that's exactly right. He's got the Ottomans as 1320 to 1570, and again, this is very arbitrary because. Again, I think that he's done this because in 1566 you have the death of Suleiman the Magnificent, and that's where a lot of people begin the decline of the Ottoman Empire. But the Ottoman Empire was still a great power. It was still a strong, effective force. It still was able to conquer territory after the death of Suleiman the Magnificent. And I would argue that it wasn't really until you have the failed siege of Vienna in 1688 that it really starts to enter a proper period of decline.
Yeah, like for instance, I'd argue that the Ottoman Empire is interesting in that. So of course the collapse was 1918. I think it was disbanded. I give or take a few years. I forget the exact date, but even so, in practice, it wasn't really able to exercise like hegemonic power over a lot of its regions, even within the last 100 years of its existence. So I'd extend it maybe till about late 1800s if I were him. But even so, what's really interesting is how the Ottoman Empire. So I'd say sort of if we were to give sort of a poetic date to the end of Islamic civilization, I'd say the symbolic moment would have been the Battle of the Nile. And then when you really started seeing the British and French incursions into the area, I guess, lining up sort of with the barbarian invasions in Rome. But what's interesting about the Ottoman Empire, it almost existed as its own thing after the collapse of sort of Islamic civilization, particularly due to attempts to westernize, which was a process that it had already been undergoing for the past 200 years. So to play the devil's advocate real quick for Glubb, I'd say if maybe he chose that date because that really is the beginning of the Ottomans attempting to sort of create a more European style power and to adopt more European cultural elements to it. So
possibly. Actually, come to think of it, looking at the date, I think 1570 was the Battle of Lepanto, which was that great Ottoman naval defeat. So perhaps that's why he's done that. Though I would argue that their naval power wasn't crushed as a result of that, though that was a setback.
Yeah. So kind of like the Ottoman equivalent of like Actium.
Oh yes, yeah, that's a good comparison. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Oh, so just to go back to the Arabs, I mean, as they're one of the empires that he's most familiar with, I'm actually going to defend his dating because 634 is the death of the Prophet Muhammad. So this is when you have the beginning of the Caliphate as an institution. So by 880, so this 246-year period, it covers the Rashidun Caliphate, the entire Umayyad Caliphate, and then the first 100 years or so, 120 years of the Abbasids. And 861, which is just before the end of his period, is where you have an event called the Anarchy at Samarra, which is where the Caliph al-Muwatakil was murdered by his Turkish bodyguards. And this leads to essentially a Arab equivalent of the crisis of the 3rd century, where you just have this, you have like 10 different caliphs being brought to the throne in like a decade. You have a slave uprising in Iraq, and you have rapid political decentralization. And 880 is, by this point, there is no really sovereign caliphate. It's just simply this ceremonial religious position who's a vassal of the Buyids in Iran. So
that's a pretty good comparison, I'd say. And it's interesting how he ends up lumping the various early caliphates together kind of into a singular empire, which I'd say is fair. However, I think there is a little more nuance to it in a sense. However, at the same time, if you were to make that argument, you could also easily make the argument that the Principate and the Dominate were two separate empires. However, I don't know if that is still entirely accurate, but it's still an argument that could be made.
Certainly. Now his Spanish dates here I find very strange because he's put 1500. I mean, that seems a bit arbitrary, and then 1750. So again, I'm literally just doing exactly 250 years from the beginning of the 16th century. I mean, just to bring up a comparison, obviously, there's this concept of Spanish history of the rise of Spanish power, the Siglo de Oro, or the Spanish Golden Age, which is traditionally begun in 1492 when you have the conquest of Granada by the Iberian monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, and also the year that Columbus discovers America and the beginning of the Spanish conquest of the New World. And then Siglo de Oro is traditionally ended in 1659 with the end of the Franco-Spanish War. But of course, that is a bit short. So, I mean, in terms of Spain's empire, yes, by 1750, Spain was certainly not as strong as she once was. But in 1750, though the Habsburgs had been gone by that point, and you've got the Bourbons, most of their empire was still under their control. And it wasn't really until the Napoleonic Wars and the revolutions in the Americas that they started rapidly losing territory.
Yeah, that's why I would extend that date also about to the early, at the absolute latest, maybe 1840s or so. But I'd say really post-Napoleonic Wars, I'd say that's really when you could put an end to Spain as a great power. And of course, it's still insisted upon being an empire and called itself an empire. But in practice, pretty much the empire had fallen by then. And any semblance of colonial power it still had left was effectively gone by the end of the Spanish-American War.
No, absolutely. With the brief exception of like Spanish in Northern Africa.
Oh yeah,
Other
yeah.
than that, yeah, nothing really.
But that's because they could still assert their power. It just became like a regional power more or less after that, because that was still close enough to Spain to be effectively governed.
No, absolutely. So then with Russia, he's expressly just done the Romanov dynasty, which is from looking at this table, it's the only time he's given a specific dynasty as an empire rather than the whole empire itself. So 1682 is when Peter the Great becomes Tsar of Russia. And again, this is also a problem because the Romanov dynasty does precede Peter the Great. He wasn't the first Romanov Tsar, albeit he was probably the first one to really make Russia a great European power. And obviously, 1916 is around the time the Tsars were forced to abdicate. So,
yeah, and so I mean, we also need to remember that like states both precede and exist after the empire itself has collapsed, because the empire as a term is purely geopolitical. It has nothing to do with the state itself, and really has nothing to do with what form of government exists within it. Like you can have an empire that is governed by a republic. You can have an empire that's governed by a monarchy. So really the political system doesn't matter as well as the government that has existed or how long it's existed. It really refers to when it started becoming imperialist in like the larger geopolitical sense, which is also why I do generally agree with where he places the Roman Republic. I'd say closer to 280, but like, I mean, really I'm grasping at straws there. But that's really, yes, the Roman Republic existed before that, but the empire of the Republic itself really began during that period when it started expanding outward, beginning with the Italian peninsula and then spreading to Greece. And then, of course, you had the Carthaginian Wars, which I'd say was pretty much their equivalent of like the World Wars. And the United States eventually, similar to how the United States ended up becoming the primary hegemonic power following that. So,
no, certainly. And just to touch on, he's got Britain as 1700 to 1950. I'd say that's relatively accurate, though if I'm going to be autistic, I'm actually going to move those dates a little bit. I personally would say 1707 to 1957. And why do I pick that? Well, Britain didn't formally become a state until 1707 when you have the Act of Union. So that's one reason. But secondly, I did a stream earlier, about a month ago, with Charlemagne on the Suez Crisis, which was in the autumn of 1956. And as a result of the Suez Crisis, you have the resignation of Anti-Eden the following year in 1957. And Suez, I think, really displayed that Britain was no longer an imperial power. So that's why I picked those dates. You have the creation, the Act of Union to the Suez Crisis. That's my framing, though. I can sort of, Glub's not far off. I can kind of forgive his dates there.
Yeah, I'd actually make the argument that you can, even though it wasn't Britain yet, because of course Great Britain didn't become like Great Britain, and the British Empire itself is not really considered to been an entity, especially in terms of the connotation of the term itself, until the early 18th century, like around the time of the War of the Spanish Succession. But you could make an argument that the Age of Pioneers began a century before that. And of course, you have the colonization of the Americas, which dominated most of Britain's early 17th century foreign endeavors. And then, of course, you had the wars with the Dutch. And then eventually you had the wars against the Spanish and eventually the French. But you could even argue that the turning point in sort of the beginning of solidifying Britain as a great power, even 1588 or so. So, I mean, you could put it at 1700 if you want. So, like, I'm not going to fault Glub for that. But then you could also make an argument for 1607 with the founding of Jamestown, or the defeating the Dutch in the 1670s, 1660s or 1670 or whatever, or the Spanish Armada in 1588, which really started giving Britain, or England at the time, the edge it needed in order to basically, they were able to establish the preconditions of what would later allow them to establish their empire proper.
And thinking of union, you could possibly say 1603 because that's where James I becomes king, and you have the union of England, Scotland, and Ireland under one monarch. So, though
Yeah.
there's no formal British state, you still have the union of the three crowns, and also that was actually where the origins of the British flag, because the British flag was created in 1603 by James as a naval ensign. So the British flag was not used politically; it was used for the navy to represent
Yeah.
the Union of England and Scotland.
And that's why it's called the Union Jack, because that's a naval connotation traditionally referred to. Like for instance, the American Union Jack is a purely naval flag.
Thank you. So underneath this table, Gloves sort of put his own comments and sort of gives some justification for what he's chosen. So this list calls for certain comments. 1. The present writer is exploring the facts, not trying to prove anything. The dates given are largely arbitrary. Empires do not usually begin or end on a certain date. There is normally a gradual period of expansion and then a period of decline. The resemblance in the duration of these great powers may be queried. Human affairs are subject to many chances, and it is not to be expected that they could be calculated with mathematical accuracy. 2. Nevertheless, it is suggested that there is sufficient resemblance between the life periods of these different empires to justify further study. 3. The division of Rome into two periods may be thought unwarranted. The first, or Republican period, dates from the time when Rome became the mistress of Italy and ends with the accession of Augustus. The imperial periods extend from the accession of Augustus to the death of Marcus Aurelius. It is true that the empire survived nominally for more than a century after this date, but it did so in constant confusion, rebellion, civil wars, and barbarian invasions. So is there anything you wanted to come in with, or?
No, not really. I think we pretty much addressed that.
Okay. And then 4. Not all empires endured for their full lifespan. The Babylonian Empire of Nebuchadnezzar, for example, was overthrown by Cyrus after a life duration of only some 74 years. In fact, you could even argue the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which he's referring to there, was an extension of the Assyrian Empire. It ruled largely the same territory. It had a similar linguistic culture and the same religious structure. So you could almost say it was just a different dynasty, and the capital was in a different city, really.
Yeah. No, yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. 5. An interesting deduction from the figure seems to be that of the duration of empires does not depend on the speed of travel or the nature of weapons. The Assyrians marched on foot and fought with spears and bow and arrows. The British used artillery, railways, and ocean-going ships. Yet the two empires lasted for approximately the same periods. There's a tendency nowadays to say that this is the Jet Age, and consequently there is nothing for us to learn from past empires. Such an attitude seems to be erroneous. Yes, I would agree with that very much. 6. It is attempting to compare the lives of empires with those of human beings. We may choose a figure and say that the average life of a human being is 70 years. Not all human beings live exactly 70 years. Some die in infancy, others are killed in accidents in middle life. Some survive to the age of 80 or 90. Nevertheless, in spite of such exceptions, we are justified in saying that 70 years is a fair estimate for the average person's expectation of life. We may perhaps at this stage be allowed to draw certain conclusions. A. In spite of the accidents of fortune and the apparent circumstances of the human race at different epochs, the periods of duration of different empires at varied epochs shows remarkable similarity. B. Immense changes in the technology of transport or in methods of warfare do not seem to affect the life expectation of an empire. C. The changes in the technology of transport and war have, however, affected the shape of empires. The Assyrians, marching on foot, could only conquer their neighbours who were accessible by land: the Medes, the Babylonians, the Persians, and the Egyptians. The British, making use of ocean-going ships, conquered many countries and subcontinents which were accessible to them by water: North America, India, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, but they never succeeded in conquering their neighbours, France, Germany, and Spain. But although the shapes of the Assyrian and the British empires were entirely different, both lasted about the same length of time. So is there any comment you want to make off the back of that section? Or
I'm sorry, pardon me?
Oh, so sorry, is there any final comments you want to make off of his observations of his own dating there?
No, I totally agree with that there.
No, I would love to do too as well. Just to address a comment in the chat. So, Saw James, is Polly Toynbee the winter period of the Toynbee lineage?
Sorry, I do not get the reference.
Sorry, so Polly Toynbee, she's a journalist for The Guardian, and she's a horrible shit lib left-wing journalist. She's the granddaughter of Arnold Toynbee. So again, so putting the family in Spenglerian terms, yes, she is the winter. The thing is, Toynbee, his son Philip, who's Polly Toynbee's dad, was a communist, and so I just can't help but feel that perhaps Toynbee was too busy being a great historian as to not to be a great progenitor of his family, shall we say.
And I know his grandfather though was a pretty prominent political economist during his time, like the late 19th century. So
His uncle, who is named after.
or his uncle, yeah. Like he palled around with like John Stuart Mill and those guys, like the sort of British liberal types.
I know, absolutely. Yeah, I've been meaning to read actually his because he actually is the one who coined the term the Industrial Revolution. The elder Arnold Toynbee.
I think what's also what a lot of people seem to forget is that Toynbee was the one who coined the term postmodernism. Also,
Oh, was he?
yeah.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
I think he meant it in a slightly different way, more of like an epochal categoricalization. So not in the philosophical sense, but yeah, he said like the postmodern era began in like 1885.
Yeah, no, there was some truth in that, definitely. So, moving on. Part 3, the human yardstick. What then, we may ask, can have been the factor which caused such an extraordinary similarity in the duration of empires under such diverse conditions and such utterly different technological achievements? One of the very few units of measurement which have not seriously changed since the Assyrians is the human generation, a period of about 25 years. Thus, a period of 250 years would represent about 10 generations of people. Closer examination of the characteristics of the rise and fall of great nations may emphasize the possible significance of the sequence of generations. Let's then attempt to examine the stages in the lives of such powerful nations. It's interesting, this idea of the human generation as a measure of historical time period, because this is what Ibn Khaldun, who I've mentioned before, does. His sort of he's got a concept called asabiya, which is group feeling or social cohesion, and he argues that that lasts about 4 or 5 generations, which is about 100 years or so. And it's really interesting if you look at the various sort of dynasties that ruled various Muslim states. Is the vast majority of them actually conform to his model? Like they last about 100 years, and then they go to pot, basically.
Yeah.
Okay. Stage 4, which so that now here Glubb starting to explain his different stages of empire. So stage 1, the outburst. Again and again in history, you find a small nation treated as insignificant by its contemporaries, suddenly emerging from its homeland and overrunning large areas of the world. Prior to Philip, 359 to 336 BC, Macedon had been an insignificant state to the north of Greece. Persia was the great power of the time, completely dominating the area from Eastern Europe to India. Yet by 323 BC, 36 years after the accession of Philip, the Persian Empire had ceased to exist and the Macedonian Empire extended from the Danube to India, including Egypt. This amazing expansion may perhaps be attributed to the genius of Alexander the Great, but this cannot have been the sole reason, for although after his death everything went wrong, the Macedonian generals fought one another and established rival empires. Macedonian preeminence survived for 231 years. In the year AD 600, the world was divided between two superpower groups, as it has been for the past 50 years, between the Soviet Union and the West. The two powers were the Eastern Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. The Arabs were then despised as backward inhabitants of the Arabian Peninsula. They consisted chiefly of wandering tribes and had no government, no constitution, and no army. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa were Roman provinces. Iraq was part of Persia. The Prophet Muhammad preached in Arabia from AD 613 to 632, when he died. In 633, the Arabs burst out of their desert peninsula and simultaneously attacked the two superpowers. Within 20 years, the Persian Empire had ceased to exist. 70 years after the death of the Prophet, the Arabs had established an empire extending from the Atlantic to the plains of northern India and the frontiers of China. At the beginning of the 13th century, the Mongols were a group of savage tribes in the steppes of Mongolia. In 1211, Genghis Khan invaded China. By 1253, the Mongols have established an empire extending from Asia Minor to the China Sea, one of the largest empires the world had ever known. The Arabs ruled the greater part of Spain for 780 years, from 712 AD to 1492. 780 years back in British history would take us to 1196 and King Richard Coeur de Lion. During these 8 centuries, there have been no Spanish nation, petty kings of Aragon and Castile alone holding on in the mountains. The agreement between Ferdinand and Isabella and Christopher Columbus was signed immediately after the fall of Granada and the last Arab kingdom in Spain in 1492. Within 50 years, Cortes had conquered Mexico and Spain was the world's greatest empire. Examples of the sudden outburst by which empires are born could be multiplied indefinitely. These random illustrations must suffice. And just to make another Toynbee comparison, Toynbee's got this idea called the challenge and response, which is the idea that a civilization is thrown down like a devil's wager, essentially, by a rival civilization. And if it can rise to the challenge, this creates a great outburst of growth and energy. And Toynbee is the same thing with the Spanish. They were put under intense pressure by the Muslims in Spain, and this is why you have this grand sort of reconquest, and then that reconquest extends out into the Spanish and Portuguese establishing the first global empires.
Yeah, precisely. Mm-hmm. I generally agree with his analysis, particularly in this part. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then we've got characteristics of the outburst. These sudden outbursts are usually characterized by an extraordinary display of energy and courage. The new conquerors are normally poor, hardy, and enterprising, above all aggressive. The decaying empires which overthrow are wealthy but defensive-minded. In the time of Roman greatness, the legions used to dig a ditch around their camps at night to avoid surprise. But the ditches were mere earthworks, and between them wide spaces were left through which Romans could counterattack. But as Rome grew older, the earthworks became high walls, for which access was given only by narrow gates. Counterattacks were no longer possible. The legions were now passive defenders. And that's also interesting for talking about the British Empire, because when you get to World War II, the entire British imperial strategy was all about imperial defense. We need to hold on in Asia. We need to hold on in Africa. It's not about conquering or absorbing new territories at this point. It's just conserving what's already been held.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's a shame they had to go blindly into a war with the mid-century Germans and throw it all away. But well. Okay, but the new nation not only distinguished by victory in battle, but by unresting enterprise in every field. Men hacked their way through jungles, climbed mountains, or braved the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans in tiny cockle shells. The Arabs crossed the Straits of Gibraltar in AD 711 with 12,000 men, defeated the Gothic army of more than twice their strength, and marched straight over 250 miles of unknown enemy territory and seized the Gothic capital of Toledo. At the same stage in British history, Captain Cook discovered Australia. British initiative characterised such periods. Other peculiarities of the period of the conquering pioneers are their readiness to improvise and experiment. Untrammeled by traditions, they will turn anything available to their purpose. If one method fails, they try something else. Uninhibited by textbooks or book learning, action is their solution to every problem. Poor, hardy, often half-starved and ill-clad, they abound in courage, energy, and initiative, overcome every obstacle, and always seem to be in control of the situation. 6. The causes of race outbursts. The modern instinct is to seek a reason for everything and to doubt the veracity of a statement for which a reason cannot be found. So many examples can be given of the sudden eruption of an obscure race into a nation of conquerors that the truth of the phenomenon cannot be held to be doubtful. To assign a cause is more difficult. Perhaps the easiest explanation is to assume that the poor and obscure race is tempted by the wealth of ancient civilization, and there would undoubtedly appear to be an element of greed for loot in barbarian invasions. Such motivation may be divided into two classes. The first is mere loot, plunder, and rape, as for example in the case of Attila and the Huns, who ravaged a great part of Europe from AD 450 to AD 453. However, when Attila died in the latter year, his empire fell apart and his tribes returned to Eastern Europe. Many of the barbarians who founded dynasties in Western Europe on the ruins of the Roman Empire, however, did so out of admiration for Roman civilization and themselves aspired to become Romans. Yeah, that's interesting. This sort of, because again, you see this a lot in the time we live in. There's this rejection of what, a priori rationalism. It's got to be, have you got a source for that? Have you got a peer-reviewed journal to explain that position? Otherwise, it's not true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's definitely one of that was Spengler's main criticism, because you even had this going back to the early 20th century, late 19th century, especially because earlier we were talking about like the dominance of the British more empirical approach to that. And you have a lot of brilliant studies even today that just get completely rejected by mainstream historians purely because it comes from a different methodological perspective of analysis. But they're just ignored and outright rejected, even though they're more accurate than a lot of the shit that academia puts out now.
No, I actually recall from when I was doing my final year of my degree and I was writing essays, and my tutor would comment on my essays, say things like, have you not considered the problem from a Marxist perspective, from a feminist perspective? And I was just like, oh, for God's sake, don't put me through this.
You should have just replied, I don't find those perspectives particularly interesting.
Mm.
So wait, they were trying to get you to write it from a Marxist perspective? Like, did you straight up tell them that you weren't a Marxist? Did you tackle it from a different perspective? Like,
I guess the perspective is that I should cover all perspectives, and I just thought, well, I don't want to cover perspectives I don't agree with. So
yeah.
So I had to be
I find it funny
universal
that,
and
like,
not.
I mean, I don't really see. I don't know, in the history community, sort of the historical community. I generally tend to, Marxism generally tends to be rejected. It's same, of course, within economics, but it really only exists in the social sciences now. Like, I remember I took a Marxist film. It was just called Introduction to Film, but it was I needed another elective back when I was in school, and it was primarily from a Marxist perspective. I did straight up tell my professor, "Hey, I'm not a fan of the sort of Marxist analysis," and he was like, "Yeah, that's completely fine." I don't know if he was personally a Marxist, but I got the sense he was like sympathetic. But he was like, "Yeah, no, that's totally fine. It's just important to study things from various perspectives," which I understand. But I mean, my biggest issue isn't so much that Marxism is wrong, which, I mean, it is, but it's more so I just don't think it's a particularly interesting or useful method of studying history.
Yeah, and people act like it's a fail-safe system of study, and it's not. It's my problem with it is that it's a materialist conception of history, and I'm much more of an idealist conception. History is driven by ideas, not purely by money.
And while not particularly Marxist, I mean, you still do have a heavy emphasis on materialism within the study of, like, the development of civilizations, where it purely is like, okay, practical economic need for this, especially with, like, the development of cities, and it's like, this led to this led to this, and then, I mean, and again, like, you shouldn't reject the importance of that, but there's definitely a spiritual aspect you need to consider too, because, I mean, even material development and economic growth, like back in like ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt and stuff, was at the hip fundamentally connected to religion as well. Like, farming was seen for, sorry, I heard a door open. Farming, for example, was a very spiritual practice. Like, I mean, with the idea of fertility, and then I'm not going to get into it, but there was almost like a weird sexual connotation in some cultures with farming.
Oh, that's I suppose with the idea of fertility, I could see why that would be the case. But I think that's a discussion for another day. That's quite a whole rabbit hole, I think. So
yeah.
Okay. Next, section 7, a providential turnover. Whatever causes may be given for the overthrow of great civilizations by barbarians, we can sense resulting benefits. Every race on Earth has distinctive characteristics. Some have been distinguished in philosophy, some in administration, some in romance, poetry, or religion, some in their legal system. During the preeminence of each culture, distinctive characteristics are carried by it far and wide across the world. If the same nation were to retain its domination indefinitely, its peculiar qualities would permanently characterize the whole human race, and the system of empires each lasting 250 years. The sovereign race has time to spread its particular virtues far and wide. Then, however, another people with entirely different peculiarities takes its place, and its virtues and accomplishments are likewise disseminated. By this system, each of the innumerable races of the world enjoys a period of greatness, during which its peculiar qualities are placed at the service of mankind. To those who believe in the existence of God as the ruler and director of human affairs, such a system may appear as a manifestation of divine wisdom, tending towards the slow and ultimate perfection of humanity. That's interesting, because especially this idea of racial qualities. It's interesting because Glub is saying the empires that are dominant are all produced by these great races with great qualities, and you can almost say that with the decline of the empires, a lot of these empires go from, in the early stages, they're quite racially hierarchical, and when you get towards the end, you see a lot more less racial hierarchy. Because just to bring the Arabs up, for example, in the early caliphates, because in Islam, because a lot of people don't realize this, Islam itself is actually quite an egalitarian religion, because on paper all Muslims are equal, but the problem is that the Arabs themselves saw themselves as the conquerors of this great empire, so wanted to place themselves above the non-Arabs. And so in the Rashidun and Umayyad Caliphates, you would actually have this hierarchy. You would have Muslim Arabs at the top, then you would have like the Muslim non-Arabs, and then you'd have the non-Muslims at the bottom. And it's actually one of the results of the Abbasid revolution, where you could almost say the Abbasids were much more cosmopolitan. You have Iranians are now coming into the administration and Turks coming into the military. As long as you're Muslim, you can serve and advance in the system. So essentially, it's almost like racial equality and meritocracy coming quite late.
Yeah, no, agreed.
Okay. Then 8, the course of empire. The first stage of the life of a great nation, therefore, after its outburst, is a period of amazing initiative and almost incredible enterprise, courage, and hardihood. These qualities, often in a very short time, produce a new and formidable nation. These early victories, however, are won chiefly by reckless bravery and daring initiative. The ancient civilization thus attacked will have defended itself by its sophisticated weapons and by its military organization and discipline. The barbarians quickly appreciate the advantages of these military methods and adopt them. As a result, the second stage of expansion of the new empire consists of more organized, disciplined, and professional campaigns. In other fields, the daring initiative of the original conquerors is maintained in geographical exploration. For example, pioneering new countries, penetrating new forests, climbing unexplored mountains, and sailing uncharted seas. The new nation is confident, optimistic, and perhaps contemporaneous of the decadent races which it has subjugated. The methods employed tend to be practical and experimental, both in government and in warfare, for they're not tied by centuries of tradition as happens in ancient empires. Moreover, the leaders are free to use their own improvisations, not having studied politics or tactics in schools or in textbooks. 9. USA in the stage of the pioneers. In the case of the United States of America, the pioneering period did not consist of a barbarian conquest of an effete civilization, but of the conquest of barbarian peoples. Thus viewed from the outside, every example seems to be different, but viewed from the standpoint of the great nation, every example seems to be similar. The United States arose suddenly as a new nation, and its period of pioneering was spent in the conquest of a vast continent, not an ancient empire. Yet the subsequent life history of the United States had followed the standard pattern which we shall attempt to trace, the periods of the pioneers, of commerce, of affluence, of intellectualism, and of decadence. Of just drawing some comparison, you can almost say the American conquest of the Indian was a bit like the Roman conquest of Gaul.
Yeah, I'd say that. However, I'd actually place, because there was the period like Manifest Destiny and the period of the spread of American administrative power and, of course, settling the West. However, I wouldn't, ironically, despite them being called the pioneers in American history, in reality, I'd actually say that that's more the age of conquest. And it was like a decentralized, as opposed to the age of pioneers. And the age of pioneers, I'd say, was more like early 1800s. So from, I guess, like the time of the Lewis and Clark expedition under Thomas Jefferson through about 1820. So the years following the War of 1812. And then really with Manifest Destiny, in a lot of regards, it was almost like a decentralized civilian conquest as opposed to a giant coordinated military effort, which those campaigns didn't start until later, again, with the conquest of the Native American peoples, like the Indian Wars of the 1860s and the 1870s. So,
yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And just a comment. So, Sir James, Raymond de Toulouse, richest count chilling in South France, decided to go and fight and die in the scorching desert for purely material reasons. Some Marxists probably, well, that's also the take if you were to, I don't know, believe a film like Kingdom of Heaven, especially that horrific interpretation of the past. Okay, next step, we've got stage 10. Commercial expansion. The conquest of vast areas of land and their subjection to one government automatically acts as a stimulant to commerce. Both merchants and goods can be exchanged over considerable distances. Moreover, if the empire be an extensive one, it will include a great variety of climates, producing extremely varied products, which the different areas will wish to exchange with one another. The speed of modern methods of transportation tends to create in us the impression that far-flung commerce is a modern development, but this is not the case. Objects made in Ireland, Scandinavia, China have been found in the graves or the ruins of the Middle East, dating from 1,000 years before Christ. The means of transport were slower, but when a great empire was in control, commerce was freed from the innumerable shackles imposed upon it today by passports, import permits, customs boycotts, and political interference. The Roman Empire extended from Britain to Syria and Egypt, a distance in a direct line of perhaps 2,700 miles. A Roman official transferred from Britain to Syria might spend 6 months on the journey, yet throughout the whole distance he would be travelling in the same country with the same official language, the same laws, the same currency, and the same administrative system. Today, some 20 independent countries separate Britain from Syria, each with its own government, its own laws, politics, customs, fees, passports, and currencies, making commercial cooperation almost impossible. And this process of disintegration is still continuing. Even within the small areas of the modern European nations, provincial movements demanding secession or devolution tend further to splinter the continent. That's actually interesting, him saying that, because in some ways, despite how broken up the world is into these nation states, you could almost argue we've gone the opposite way. We've got extreme globalized commerce through international free trade. And also, if we're looking at somewhere like Europe, I think the European Union largely facilitates a lot of this through its four freedoms, the freedom of goods, services, and people, etc.
Yeah, no, agreed. And I think one thing that Glubb, it's interesting what Glubb talks about is how, in a lot of regards, even though of course we have like free trade now, when an empire breaks up, it is a lot more difficult to sort of, especially with like rising nationalist sentiments in former colonies, it is a lot more difficult to facilitate open trade. Again, because a lot of the time, and then also you see like with the independence of Iran, you also saw the nationalization of British corporation, like the Anglo-Iranian oil company, which was completely nationalized by the Iranians. And that again made commerce more difficult for Britain.
Well, just sorry to nitpick, but it was nationalised, but then that was reversed when you had the 1953 coup in Iran, and though albeit the Anglo-Iranian oil company, now BP, was significantly cut down to size by the international oil industry after that, because essentially, listen, you were too oppressive and extractive. You now got to have a more better relationship, because actually after that coup happened, though Mossadegh's government was overthrown, the BP was actually forced to pay a higher percentage of its profits to the Iranian government as a consolation. Yes, so interesting tangent, but it's just the point I wanted to raise. But no, broadly speaking, you are right. So I think a better example, if we're talking about nationalisation, would actually be the Suez with Nasser nationalising the Suez Canal, which was a key linchpin of the British Empire. And so with the loss of that, the empire was really over, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's carry on. So the present fashion for independence has produced great numbers of tiny states in the world, some of them consisting of only one city or a small island. This system is an insuperable obstacle to trade and cooperation. The present European Economic Community is an attempt to secure commercial cooperation among small independent states over a large area, but the plan meets with many difficulties due to the mutual jealousies of so many nations. Well, in fairness to Glubb, he was writing this in 1978, so this was before the actual this was before the Maastricht Treaty in 92 with the formal creation of the EU. So, they largely speaking, were able to work out a lot of their differences, with the notable exception of Brexit. So even savage and militaristic empires promoted commerce, whether or not they intended to do so. The Mongols were some of the most brutal military conquerors in the history, massacring the entire populations of cities. Yes, in the 13th century, when their empire extended from Peking to Hungary, caravan trade between China and Europe achieved a remarkable degree of prosperity. The whole journey was in territory of one government. In the 8th and 9th centuries, the Caliphs of Baghdad achieved fabulous wealth owing to the immense extent of their territories, which constituted a single trade bloc. The empire of the Caliphs is now divided into some 25 separate nations. And just to add another point to that, a point Grubb does bring up in his Arab history books is that when the Arabs conquered the Levant and the territories off of the Romans, this actually led to a great breakdown in international trade because Europe was now cut off from the Far East, and it actually led to a great decline in living standards because a lot of the exotic luxury resources were no longer accessible through trade.
Yeah.
So if anything, you have this grand commercial system within the empire, but as soon as you get to that border and the territories outside the empire, that's where trade breaks down. Okay. And part 11, the pros and cons of empires. In discussing the life story of the typical empire, we have digressed into a discussion of whether empires are useful or injurious to mankind. We seem to have discovered that empires have certain advantages, particularly in the field of commerce and in the establishment of peace and security in vast areas of the globe. Perhaps we should also include the spread of varied cultures to many races. The present infatuation for independence for even smaller and smaller units will eventually doubtless be succeeded by new international empires. And in saying that, I can't help but think of the Yugoslav wars, where not only was Yugoslavia broken up, but we can't even accept the idea of a greater Serbia. No, we've got to break off Kosovo, and even though Kosovo is Albanian speakers, we can't even unite it with Albania. It's got to be this pathetic rump state. We've also got to break off the Montenegrins as well. It's just absurd.
Mm-hmm.
And then the present attempts to create a European community may be regarded as a practical endeavour to constitute a new superpower, in spite of the fragmentation resulting from the craze for independence. If it succeeds, some of the local independencies will have to be sacrificed. If it fails, the same result may be attained by military conquest or by the partition of Europe between rival superpowers. The inescapable conclusion seems, however, to be that larger territorial units are benefits to commerce and to public stability. Whether the broader territory be achieved by voluntary association or by military action. 12. Sea power. One of the more benevolent ways in which a superpower can promote both peace and commerce is by command of the sea. From Waterloo to 1914, the British Navy commanded the seas of the world. Britain grew rich, but she also made the seas safe for the commerce of all nations and prevented major wars for 100 years. Curiously enough, the question of sea power was never quite clearly distinguished. In British politics during the last 50 years, from the question of imperial rule over other countries, in fact, the two subjects are entirely distinct. Sea power does not offend small countries, as does military occupation. If Britain had maintained her navy with a few naval bases overseas in isolated islands and had given independence to colonies which asked for it, the world might well be a more stable place today. In fact, however, the navy was swept away in the popular outcry against imperialism. That's an interesting take of his. I mean, personally, I would partially disagree with the 19th century being free of major wars. I mean, fair enough, there was no major war between all the great powers of Europe between the Napoleonic Wars and World War One, but there was still, conflicts between the great powers. You still had the Crimean War, you had the Franco-Prussian War, you also had the 7 Weeks' War, or the German Brothers' War, for example. So the wars still did happen, and there was still death and destruction, though it was limited before and after to some extent. Next, we've got the Age of Commerce. So let's now, however, return to the life story of the typical empire. We've already considered the Age of Outburst, when a little regarded people suddenly bursts onto the world stage with a wild courage and energy. Let's call it the Age of the Pioneers. Then we saw that these new conquerors acquired the sophisticated weapons of the old empires and adopted their regular systems of military organization and training. A great period of military expansion ensued, which we may call the Age of Conquest. The conquest resulted in the acquisition of vast territories under one government, led by automatically giving rise to commercial prosperity. We may call this the Age of Commerce. The Age of Conquest, of course, overlaps the Age of Commerce. The proud military tradition still holds sway, and the great armies guard the frontiers, but gradually the desire to make money seems to gain hold of the public. During the military period, glory and honour were the principal objects of ambition. To the merchant, such ideas are but empty words which add nothing to the bank balance. Something Academic Agent has brought up is another way of looking at these empires is who the elite and hierarchy are made up of. So during the Age of Conquests, especially if you look at somewhere like the British Empire, the two elites, it was a union of merchants and warriors. And when you get to sort of the Age of Commerce or the Age of Affluence, the merchants are starting to take more and more of a sway over how the system works.
Yeah. No, I generally agree with what he says there. As in like AA.
I know certainly, and later on when you get to the age of intellect, the priestly caste, well, the secular priestly caste comes in union with the merchant, which is the system we live under today. Next, we've got 14, art and luxury. So the wealth which seems, almost without effort, to pour into the country enables the commercial classes to grow immensely rich. How to spend all this money becomes a problem to the wealthy business community. Art, architecture, and luxury find rich patrons. Splendid municipal buildings and wide streets lend dignity and beauty to the wealthy areas of great cities. The rich merchants build themselves palaces, and money is invested in communications, highways, bridges, railways, or hotels, according to the various patterns of the ages. The first half of the age of commerce appears to be peculiarly splendid. The ancient virtues of courage, patriotism, and devotion to duty are still in evidence. The nation is proud, united, and full of self-confidence. Boys are still required, first of all, to be manly, to ride, to shoot straight, and to tell the truth. It is remarkable what emphasis is placed at this stage on the manly virtue of truthfulness, for lying is cowardice, the fear of facing up to the situation. Boys' schools are intentionally rough. Frugal eating, hard living, breaking the ice to have a bath, and similar customs are aimed at producing a strong, hardy, and fearless breed of men. Duties to word constantly drummed into the heads of young people. The age of commerce is also marked by great enterprise in the exploration of the new forms of wealth. Daring initiative is shown in the search for profitable enterprises in far corners of the earth, perpetuating to some degree the adventurousness courage of the age of conquests. And it's interesting, Club, talking about the education system here, because something tells me he's probably relaying back to his own education in the British schooling system. He probably had to go through a lot of this himself.
Mm-hmm.
And it also makes me think about how fake and gay the world we live in is today. It's so like feminized. Oh, it's okay for you to cry, men. No, it's not okay to cry. And speaking of the subversion of the education system, there was actually a controversy some years ago, which I'm reminded of, where a exams paper from Eton College got leaked, and the question was something like, there's a political crisis, and there was violent riots throughout the country, which are then violently put down by the police. You're the prime minister, and you have to give a speech justifying the government's action here. And the left absolutely chimped out over this, because they said, "Oh, this is hierarchical. This is like fascist." And it's like, no, it's not. Elite is a school for the elite, or the elite, the governors, the rulers. They have to be prepared for their future position in life. So this is not unsurprising. They need to be prepared. They're not going to be prepared if you just pamper them or don't even give them any like ideas of the situations they may have to deal with in a position of power.
So are you referring to the recent issues going on with the migrants?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, but no, what I'm saying is there was an older story where an actual exam paper from Eton got leaked, and the question was literally a scenario like Starmer had to deal with the riots. And it's interesting now that the left seems to have completely about-faced on that issue. A few years ago, they were like, this is even a fascist, but now when it's a left-wing government attacking Murtha right, they're suddenly all in favour of it. Yeah. So perhaps the left aren't against the idea of an elite, only a right-wing elite. So
really, no one is. It's just a matter of everyone just wants their elite to be in charge.
No, true. Again, the left were more free speech, and now no more free speech. Free speech is fascist.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Like I honestly can't wrap my head around the fact that there are actually some people who believe that.
What, believe in free speech, or?
No, who believe that free speech is fascist. Like it makes no sense at all. Like I can't comprehend the thought process. Maybe I'm just naive, but I quite literally can't grasp my head around why. It's like, okay, if you want to oppose free speech, fine, but don't call it what it's not. Like, I mean, it's bizarre.
Well, I suppose it's the iron grip of the boomer truth regime.
Yeah.
Okay. So Part 15, the age of affluence. So there does not appear to be any doubt that money is the agent which causes the decline of the strong, brave, and self-confident people. The decline in courage, enterprise, and sense of duty is, however, gradual. The first direction in which wealth injures the nation is a moral one. Money replaces honour and adventure as the objective of the best young men. Moreover, men do not normally seek to make money for their country or their community, but for themselves. Gradually and almost imperceptibly, the age of affluence silences the voice of duty. The object of the young and the ambitious is no longer fame, honour, or service, but cash. The education undergoes the same gradual transformation. No longer do schools aim at producing brave patriots ready to serve their country. Parents and students alike seek the educational qualifications which will command the highest salaries. The Arab moralist Ghazali, 1058 to 1111, complains in these very same words of the lowering of objectives in the declining Arab world of his time. Students, he says, no longer attend college to acquire learning and virtue, but to obtain those qualifications which will enable them to grow rich. The same situation is everywhere evident among us in the West today. And it's even more tragic because not only are people going to these universities and colleges to become rich because they want to use this knowledge to get a good job, but most of them don't end up getting a college required job anyway and end up working in Starbucks. They don't even get wealth and just get a heavy amount of debt around their neck. Yeah. It's all the rather sick joke, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, 16, the high noon. That which we may call the high noon of the nation covers the period of transition from the age of conquest to the age of affluence. The age of Augustus in Rome, that of Harun al-Rashid in Baghdad, or Suleiman the Magnificent in the Ottoman Empire, or Queen Victoria in Britain. Perhaps we might add the age of Woodrow Wilson in the United States. That's actually interesting because it's interesting he chooses to put Wilson as the high noon of America because it's interesting because if you take his 250-year model, if you start with 1776, 250 years would be 2026, which is in 2 years' time. And the midpoint of that is roughly Woodrow Wilson. So I can kind of see where he's coming from. I mean, would you agree with that?
I'd say the high noon was more for the Roman Empire because Augustus was really early on. I'd put it more around the time of like Trajan and Hadrian.
Sorry, I was specifically talking about the American case.
Oh, in the American case, I wouldn't. I'd say high noon. Honestly, believe it or not, I'd put high noon kind of more. I'd say post World War II through, I don't know, maybe late 90s, early 2000s.
I mean, I can see where you're coming from on that, and this is the great debate: is when will the American Empire collapse? Because because more strict interpretations of Glubb's idea would say 1776 to 2026, and Donald Trump is going to presage the end of the American Empire, which is.
I'd actually, so I say this half jokingly, but I'd put Trump kind of in the sort of commodus camp, like 2016 was our 180 kind of. I'm not like some TDS anti-Trumper or anything, but I think just like from an objective analytical perspective, I think Trump definitely embodies sort of like the character of an empire that is degrading, or a culture that is degrading. Because I mean, let's face it, like his policies or not, he's kind of a degenerate.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be honest with you. He's better than his opposition, but if we look through the grand span of American presidents, he's not quite up to the same caliber as people like George Washington or Andrew Jackson.
Absolutely not. No, and it just always makes me cringe when you have like the hardcore, like the people who are obsessed with Trump, but like as in like the ones who love him, like sort of like the MAGA cultists. Like there's a difference, of course, between like a Trump supporter, a Trump voter, and a Trump cultist. So like, I mean, like the hardcore MAGA people who think he's like the best president ever, it's like you can vote for him, you could like him, you could support his policies. Like he has some good policies. I mean, I'd say better than Kamala by a long shot, but I mean, he's not like some great president. Like he's not Caesar or anything.
This is the thing that this whole idea of him being he's like Caesar. No, it's funny because Sargon made a video.
Oh, I was just about to bring up Sargon about how he thinks Trump is like Caesar and stuff, and honestly, I think it's I think it's kind of a dumb take.
Well, I remember him doing a video back in 2016, and I'm pretty sure he compared Trump more to the Gracchi, which I think is a more, I think that's a better comparison personally, because the Gracchi were ultimately failures, and Trump thus far, he is tracking like the Gracchi. He's been kind of a failure, especially if he doesn't get re-elected. Because
if I were actually, I'd push back on that. I'd say like that the Kennedy brothers were more along the lines of the Gracchi. And I'd say Trump was closer to someone like Publius Clodius Pulcher or possibly Crassus.
It's funny you say Crassus, because when when Trump first got elected and people were literally calling him Hitler, I was thinking to myself, well, I think a better historical comparison would be Crassus, and I think it's funny that you've come to the same conclusion.
Yeah, I'd say he's even closer to like Publius Clodius Pulcher, who is like this really, really. So he was like born into wealth in the patrician class. Then he denounces sort of his nobility to frame himself as a man of the people. He was a bit of a grifter, but eventually he ended up becoming tribune. He was like Cicero's arch nemesis, and he kept calling to exile Cicero, and eventually, like I said, he became the tribune. The guy was married 3 times. He was kind of a sexual deviant. This one time he dressed as a woman to sneak into a party to seduce Julius Caesar's second wife. And eventually...
I remember reading the story.
Eventually he ended up getting like... the people turned on him and they like stabbed him in the street. And it was... yes, I mean, he was similar to the Gracchi, but like the Gracchi were more like, I guess, ideological, whereas he was more of an opportunist, Pulcher. But the similarities to Trump are just, I've always found very, very, very funny. Even though like he never made it to consul or anything, but he had a good chance of eventually being consul. And tribune was a very powerful position in the Senate too. So like, I mean, I think the comparison is apt.
Yeah, no, well, thank you for that. That's insightful. I might have to read more about Pulcher. So, carrying on. All these periods reveal the same characteristics. Hang on. Oh yeah, that's where I am. The immense wealth accumulated in the nation dazzles the onlookers. Enough of the ancient virtues of courage, energy, and patriotism survive to enable the state successfully to defend its frontiers. But beneath the surface, greed for money is gradually replacing duty and public service. Indeed, the change might be summarized as being from service to selflessness. Yeah, I would agree with that. 17, defensiveness. Another outward change which invariably marks the transition from the age of conquest to the age of affluence is the spread of defensiveness. The nation, immensely rich, is no longer interested in glory or duty, but is only anxious to retain its wealth and its luxury. It is a period of defensiveness, from the Great Wall of China to Hadrian's Wall on the Scottish border, to the Maginot Line in France in 1939. Money being in better supply than courage, subsidies instead of weapons are employed to buy off enemies. To justify this departure from ancient tradition, the human mind easily devises its own justification. Military readiness or aggressiveness is denounced as primitive and immoral. Civilized peoples are too proud to fight. The conquest of one nation by another is declared to be immoral. Empires are wicked. This intellectual device enables us to suppress our feeling of inferiority when we read of the heroism of our ancestors and then ruefully contemplate our position today. It is not that we are afraid to fight, we say, but we should consider it immoral. This even enables us to assume an attitude of moral superiority. And it's interesting, this idea of the Great Wall or Hadrian's Wall. But just to go back to Trump again, and him building, we're going to build the wall and it's going to be fantastic, and him stopping out the waves of migrants coming in is interesting, because that really is a defensive mindset if you think about it civilizationally.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, definitely Trump's calling to build the wall. It's definitely a sign of exactly what Glubb is referring to here.
Yeah, no, certainly. So the weakness of pacifism is that there are still many peoples in the world who are aggressive. Nations who proclaim themselves unwilling to fight are liable to be conquered by peoples in the stage of militarism, perhaps even to see themselves incorporated into some new empire with the status of mere provinces or colonies. When to be prepared to use force and when to give away is a perpetual human problem, but it's going to be solved as best we can in each successive situation as it rises. In fact, however, history seems to indicate that great nations do not normally disarm for motives of conscience, but owing to the weakening of a sense of duty in the citizens, and the increase in selflessness and the desire for wealth and ease. 18, the age of intellect. We have now, perhaps arbitrarily, divided the life story of our great nation into 4 ages: the age of the pioneers, or the outburst, the age of conquest, the age of commerce, and the age of affluence. The great wealth of the nation is no longer needed to supply the mere necessities or even the luxuries of life. Ample funds are available also for the pursuit of knowledge. The merchant princes of the age of commerce seek fame and praise, not only by endowing works of art or patronizing music and literature. They also found and endow colleges and universities. It is remarkable with what regularity this phrase follows on that of wealth in empire after empire, divided by many centuries. In the 11th century, the former Arab Empire, then in complete political decline, was ruled by the Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah. The Arabs, no longer warriors, were still the intellectual leaders of the world. During the reign of Malik Shah, the building of universities and colleges became a passion. Whereas a small number of universities in the great cities had sufficed the years of Arab glory, now universities sprang up in every town. In our lifetime, we have witnessed the same phenomenon in the USA and Britain. When these nations were at the height of their glory, Harvard, Yale, Oxford, and Cambridge seemed to meet their needs. Now almost every city has its university. The ambition of the young, once engaged in the pursuit of adventure and military glory, then in the desire for the accumulation of wealth, now turns to the acquisition of academic honours. Yeah, I completely agree with him. It's like in Britain today, like literally every town has a university, and with the mass creation of these universities, you see a decline in the actual quality of university education, because you just can't create Oxford and Cambridge 100 times over.
Yeah. Do you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Hello.
Hello. I can hear you.
Okay. I'm super confused right now because all my tabs closed out for some reason. Yet I still hear you.
Oh, strangely, are you sure you haven't got the stream minimized?
Yeah, I'm trying to find it. Like, I mean, all the tabs just kind of.
Yeah, you're still on StreamYard, so you've not disconnected.
Yeah, okay. Let me go back to StreamYard. That's strange.
The quirks of modern technology.
Yeah, I'm glad it didn't completely shut me out though. That's good. Hold on a second.
It's okay. Yeah, no, I've streamed before and it's accidentally booted me out before while I was in the middle of speaking. That's always fun when that happens.
Yeah. Hold on, I'm entering the studio again.
Oh, you're here twice. Okay, I'll boot the old you and just admit the new you.
There you go. Do you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, now there's a double echo. I have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, no, I've got rid of it now. There we are.
Okay. There we go.
Right. Okay. Yeah, please ignore the strange technical difficulties we're learning with StreamYards this evening. Right. Okay, let's move on. So, the opening up of natural resources and the peaceful accumulation of wealth, which marked the age of commercialism, appeared to introduce new triumphs in civilization, in culture, and the arts. In the same way, the vast expansion of the field of knowledge achieved by the age of intellect seemed to mark a new high watermark of human progress. We cannot say that any of these changes were good or bad. Striking features in the pageant of empire are the extraordinary exactitude with which these stages have followed one another, in empire after empire, over centuries or even millennia, and the fact that the successive changes seem to represent mere changes in popular fashion, new fads and fancies which sweep away public opinion without logical reason. At first, popular enthusiasm is devoted to military glory, then to the accumulation of wealth, and later to the acquisition of academic fame. Why could not all these legitimate and indeed beneficent activities be carried on simultaneously, each of them in due moderation? Yet this never seemed to happen. Yeah, no, he's got a good point there.
Yep. Agreed.
Then, yeah, the effects of intellectualism. There are so many things in human life which are not dreamt of in our popular philosophy. The spread of knowledge seems to be the most beneficial of human activities, and yet every period of decline is characterized by this expansion of intellectual activity. All the Athenians and strangers which would then spend their time in nothing else but neither to tell or hear some new thing is the description given in the Acts of the Apostles or the decline of Greek intellectualism. The age of intellect is accompanied by surprising advances in natural science. In the 9th century, for example, in the age of Mamun, the Arabs measured the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy. 7 centuries were to pass before Western Europe discovered that the world was not flat. I do kind of push back on that a bit. I would argue people in the West did know the earth was round for a lot longer than the guy was giving them credit for. It might be his favoritism for the Arabs coming in here.
Yeah.
So less than 50 years after the amazing scientific discoveries under Mamun, the Arab Empire collapsed. Wonderful and beneficent as was the progress of science, it did not save the empire from chaos. I mean, and that's true, isn't it? Because if you think about it, science is completely, or scientism as we might call it, completely dominates our society, but we're just in like total, like, complete collapse. It's almost like
absolutely.
It's like one great like echo chamber. You've just got all the university professors in the universities, and they can't see that the whole world is just burning down around them outside. The full flowering
I couldn't agree with that more.
The full flowering of Arab and Persian intellectualism did not occur until after the imperial and political collapse. Thereafter, the intellectuals attained fresh triumphs in the academic fields, but politically, they became the abject servants of the often illiterate rulers. When the Mongols conquered Persia in the 13th century, they were themselves entirely uneducated and were obliged to depend wholly on native Persian officials to administer the country and to collect the revenue. They retained as wazir or prime minister one Rashid al-Din, a historian of international repute. Yet the prime minister was, when speaking to the Mongol Ilkhan, was obliged to remain throughout the interview on his knees. At the state banquets, the prime minister stood behind the Khan's seat to wait upon him. If the Khan were in a good mood, he would occasionally pass his wazir a piece of food over his shoulder. As in the case of the Athenians, intellectualism leads to discussion, debate, and argument, such as is typical of the Western nations today. Debates in elected assemblies or local committees, in articles in the press, or in interviews on television, endlessly and incessant talking. Men are interminably different, and intellectual arguments rarely lead to agreement. Thus, public affairs drift from bad to worse amid an unceasing cacophony of argument. But its constant dedication to discussion seems to destroy the power of action. Amid a babel of talk, the ship drifts onto the rocks. I think he's so correct here, though. One thing I would say, I am going to back the Athenians a bit. I don't think the Athenians were quite as intellectually stiff as our political class are today. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, I'm sorry. I just had to add and react you again. Sorry. This bit. Okay. Yeah, so regarding the Athenians, I am going to defend them a bit because, yes, I do agree they probably were a bit overly philosophical. I don't think it's quite fair to compare them to our modern political class because there's a famous quote from Thucydides where he says, a society needs to have... people need to be smart, but also brawny. They need to harmonize brain and brawn. The idea of brain versus brawn is a false dichotomy. I think the Athenians still understood courage and honor and martial prowess as much as they understood intellectualism.
Yeah, and I wouldn't really, especially if we were to put it into a more Spenglerian framework, the idea of like these empires and cycles of like from pioneers to decadence. I feel like with each consecutive empire that sort of comes up during the sort of autumn and winter time period, I feel like each age of decadence for the different empires that progress going forward, each one, there's almost like this sort of entropy where each age of decadence is more degenerate than the last, kind of. Like, am I making sense?
No, you are, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, like, for instance, the United States' age of decadence is more pronounced and definitely more extreme compared to like the British Empire and the Spanish Empire. even though they all had their own respective ages of decadence, yeah, definitely the United States is sort of it sort of carries over the excesses of the previous ones.
Yeah, because I don't think any previous empire in human history can boast to have a transgender school shooter that goes on a rampage in a Christian school.
Oh yeah, didn't the manifesto just come out like a week or two ago for that? And then there were some outlets that were downplaying it and calling it a fraud just because it was like a conservative news outlet that actually leaked it.
Yeah, and it's just like, yeah, that stuff was absolutely horrific.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, I don't mean to dunk on America, but it adds to your point. You know, I mean that event happening alone, like imagine if Glub was alive today and I had to explain that to him, he'd probably have a heart attack.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, he would be able to comprehend it. So, okay, so men are in. Oh wait, I've read that bit. Okay. 20. The inadequacy of intellect. Perhaps the most dangerous byproduct of the age of intellect is the unconscious growth of the idea that the human brain can solve the problems of the world. Even on the low level of practical affairs, this is a patently untrue. Any small human activity, the local bowls club or the ladies' luncheon club, requires for its survival a measure of self-sacrifice and service on the part of the members. In the wider national sphere, the survival of the nation depends basically on the loyalty and self-sacrifice of the citizens. The impression that the situation can be saved by mental cleverness without unselfishness or human self-dedication can only lead to collapse. Thus, we see that the cultivation of the human intellect seems to be a magnificent ideal, but only on condition that it does not weaken unselfishness and human dedication to service. Yet this, judging by historical precedent, seems to be exactly what it does do. Perhaps it is not the intellectualism which destroys the spirit of self-sacrifice. The least we can say is that the two, intellectualism and the loss of self-duty, appear simultaneously in the life story of the nation. Indeed, it often appears in the individuals that the head and heart are natural rivals. The brilliant but cynical intellectual appears at the opposite end of the spectrum from the emotional self-sacrifice of the hero or the martyr. Yet there are times when the heroes, where perhaps the unsophisticated self-dedication of the hero is more central than the sarcasms of the clever. You know, John back at Glad BTFOing the snarky Gen Xer there. Yeah, no, you need heroes. You need myth because it's important. Because otherwise, you just have nihilism.
Yeah, and that was definitely a major part that I highlighted in the documentary that I made. And I think another thing, like Glub's analysis, sort of the immigration, is also interesting because he seems to imply that during the age of commerce, immigration isn't like inherently a bad thing and is actually good for the economy. However, but by the time of the age of intellect and the age of decadence, especially when you're starting to analyze everything, that's when like the cultural divisions really start to emerge. And that's when really, because at one point, I mean, it depends on the empire, but there are definitely many empires where I guess identity was more civic as opposed to inherently racial. And there was sort of like a healthy kind of feeling of unity. Like, for instance, in the British Empire, there was a time specifically in the 1800s where pretty much everyone, regardless of the colony, like where they were, saw themselves as sort of broadly British in sort of a cultural unified sense. But then, of course, the age of intellect comes along, and that leads to kind of more racial divisions, and then sort of regionalism and nationalism. And by that point, immigration becomes less based on whether you actually want to be a part of something greater, and integration and assimilation. There's like no longer even a desire to assimilate immigrants. Both, and you see this today on both sides of the political spectrum too. Like you have the quote unquote far right, which are like, yeah, no, they're not like us at all. It is impossible for there to be any sort of integration into a sort of broader identity. So on that hand, there's a desire not to integrate or help integrate immigrants. But then on the other side, you have the idea, oh, assimilation and integration is actually racist. And so sort of that sentiment manifests itself on both sides of the aisle, specifically today in like modern America.
It's interesting you say that. You could almost say the the far left position is like the grug position, and the far right is like the high IQ position, and then you've got the midwits in the middle. No, we can integrate everybody. You know, Nagubu is just as British as you or I, or American as you or I.
Yeah.
Okay, right. 21. Civil
In the
dissension.
age of commerce, you definitely see a healthy middle ground.
Yeah, you see a harmonization. Yep, so civil dissensions. Another remarkable and unexpected symptom of national decline is the intensification of internal political hatreds. One would have expected that when the survival of the nation became precarious, political factions would drop their rivalry and stand shoulder to shoulder to save the country. In the 14th century, the weakening empire of Byzantium was threatened, and indeed dominated by the Ottoman Turks. The situation was so serious that one would have expected every subject of Byzantium to abandon his personal interests and to stand with his compatriots. In the last desperate attempt to save the country, the reverse occurred. The Byzantines spent the last 50 years of their history in fighting one another in repeated civil wars until the Ottomans moved in and administered the coup de grace. Britain has been governed by an elected parliament for many centuries. In former years, however, the rival parties observed many unwritten laws. Neither party wished to eliminate the other. All the members referred to one another as honourable gentlemen, but such courtesies have now lapsed. Booing, shouting, and loud noises have undermined the dignity of the House, and angry exchanges are more frequent. We are fortunate in these rivalries are fought out in Parliament, but sometimes such hatreds are carried into the streets or into industry in the form of strikes, demonstrations, boycotts, and similar activities. True to the normal course followed by nations in decline, internal differences are not reconciled in the attempt to save the nation. On the contrary, internal rivalries become more acute as the nation becomes weaker. You've got to break it down.
I just think of he's pretty much describing British Parliament since the 1960s, 70s. Because, like, I mean, I'm sorry. Sometimes a guilty pleasure of mine, I will watch like a couple minutes of like a British session of Parliament. It's the funniest thing.
Yeah, I agree. It's funny, but it's also tragic.
It's sad, yeah. No, but like it's in a lot of regards. Yes, I'd say that there are probably at least, I mean, I'm not going to say there are more divisions, but the divisions in the United States, I feel like, are definitely more consequential than the current divisions in the UK. But at the same time, in American Congress, what's really interesting is it's definitely a lot less rowdy than British Parliament. And when there are arguments and stuff, it's more passive aggressive comments, which is interesting because you'd think that like the American Congress would be way more rowdy than the British one, and the British they'd be more passive aggressive than. But it's I don't know, just an interesting juxtaposition.
Yeah, no, I've always wondered that. It seems very, very paradoxical.
I don't know. It just seems like it almost reminds me of like a pub fight or something in when you go and look at the House of Commons. Like I remember that old show from the 80s. It was the puppet show, the Spitting Image. Like,
oh yeah,
that is probably like. What's funny is watching that, because I remember I watched that way over the pandemic, the old one. But I was like, yeah, no, this isn't even a parody. This is exactly how the parliamentary sessions go in the House of Commons.
Yeah, no, I've seen some clips of Spitting Image, and yeah, it's a good show.
I just remember one of the funniest clips I remember. It was Neil Kinnock talking about, it was Neil Kinnock and a young Tony Blair talking about, oh, we need to form New Labour. And what's funny is there's like a framed picture of Marx in the background, and one of the comments like, what do we do? It's like, do we just become Tories? And then the other was like, no. And Kinnock is like, no, we adopt their policies. We just adopt their policies. So it was like a commentary on proto-Blatcherism.
Blatcherism. I've not heard that expression before, but I know what it means. But yeah, I've never heard that.
I mean, in the United States, we had a similar phenomenon where Bill Clinton's economic policies were not much different than Reagan's. So I always say the Reagan administration lasted through the 90s.
Well, that's the thing, because Blair deliberately modelled himself on Bill Clinton the third way.
And in terms of foreign policy, he adopted a lot from like the neoconservative model.
No, absolutely. Okay. So next we've got the influx of foreigners. One of the oft-repeated phenomena of great empires is the influx of foreigners to the capital city. Roman historians often complain of the number of Asians and Africans in Rome. Baghdad in its prime in the 9th century was international in its population. Persians, Turks, Arabs, Armenians, Egyptians, Africans, and Greeks mingled in its streets. In London today, Cypriots, Greeks, Italians, Russians, Africans, Germans, and Indians jostle one another on the buses and in the underground, so that it sometimes seems difficult to find any British. The same applies to New York, perhaps even more so. This problem does not consist in any inferiority of one race as compared with another, but simply in the differences between them. In the age of the first outburst and the subsequent age of conquest, the race is normally ethnically more or less homogeneous. This state of affairs facilitates a feeling of solidarity and comradeship. But in the age of commerce and affluence, every type of foreigner floods into the great city, the streets of which are reputed to be paved with gold. As in most cases, this great city is also the capital of the empire. The cosmopolitan crowd at the seat of empire exercises a political influence greatly in excess of its relative numbers. Second or third generation foreign immigrants may appear outwardly to be entirely assimilated, but they often constitute a weakness in two directions. First, their basic human nature often differs from that of the original imperial stock. If the earlier imperial race were stubborn and slow moving, the immigrants might come from more emotional races, thereby introducing cracks and schisms into national policies, even if all were equally loyal. Second, while the nation is still affluent, all the diverse races may appear equally loyal, but in the acute emergency, the immigrants will often be less willing to sacrifice their lives and their property than will be the original descendants of the founder race. Third, the immigrants are liable to form communities of their own, protecting primarily their own interests and only in the second degree that of the nation as a whole. Fourth, many of the foreign immigrants will probably belong to races originally conquered by and absorbed into the empire. While the empire is enjoying its high noon of prosperity, all these people are proud and glad to be imperial citizens. But when decline sets in, it is extraordinary how the memory of ancient wars, perhaps centuries before, is suddenly revived. Local or provincial movements appear demanding of secession of independence. Someday this phenomenon will doubtless appear in the now apparently monolithic and authoritarian Soviet empire. It is amazing how long such provincial sentiments can survive. That's fascinating, especially when he's talking about the Soviets. I mean, just look at Russia and Ukraine. You know, the Ukrainian nationalists bring up, you know, the Holodomor and all of the Russian abuses of Ukraine over the centuries. Mm. And you got the Indians. Churchill calls the Bengal famine
What's your opinion on Churchill, by the way? Because I know there was that recent discourse where there's a lot of reevaluation of him, particularly sort of in sort of the spheres that we're in, but kind of extending beyond there. And I think it started with something. I think it started on Tucker. That's really what kind of got people thinking about that.
Oh, well, people have been reappraising Churchill the past couple of years, and funnily enough, on my new weekly show, the Archival Discourses, which I do every Tuesday, the first episode was actually dedicated to that very question, and I got a good panel of our friends, Years American Elitist, and my friend A.I. Shiratori, and we basically told Winston Churchill a new arsehole, basically. Yeah, it was a good stream. Yeah, but no, I think he needs to be completely repudiated as a British hero because he destroyed our country, basically.
Is it Sargon still kind of in the Churchill camp? Like, isn't he one of the guys who's like, oh yeah, no, it's just anti-Britain stuff when like the left criticizes Churchill?
Well, I actually critiqued a video he put out as part of that stream, and his view is that he's kind of neutral. He thinks we should look at Churchill like any other historical figure. We shouldn't have any real particular sentiments attached to him or Mustache Man. We just have to look at them like any other historical figures. Like if you're going to, I don't know, read about the campaigns of like Sennacherib, the Assyrian king or something.
Mm-hmm.
I can kind of get where he's coming from, but it's not quite to my taste. But let's carry on. So, historical examples of this phenomenon are scarcely needed. The idle and captious Roman mob, with its endless appetite for free distributions of food, bread, and games, is notorious and utterly different from that of stern Roman spirit, which we associate with the wars of early republic. In Baghdad, the golden days of Harun al-Rashid, Arabs were a minority in the imperial capital. Istanbul, in the great days of Ottoman rule, was peopled by inhabitants remarkably few of whom were descendants of Turkish conquerors. In New York, descendants of Pilgrim Fathers are few and far between. The interesting phenomenon is largely limited to great cities. The original conquering race is often to be found in relative purity in rural districts and on far frontiers. It is the wealth of the great cities which draws the immigrants. As with the growth of industry, cities nowadays achieve an ever greater preponderance over the countryside. So will the influence of foreigners increasingly dominate old empires. Once more, it may be emphasised that I do not wish to convey the impression that immigrants are inferior to the older stocks. They're just different, and that they thus tend to introduce cracks and divisions. I mean, he's not wrong there.
No.
Okay.
Pretty on point.
Yeah. They've got frivolity. As a nation declines in power and wealth, a universal pessimism gradually pervades the people and itself hastens to decline. There's nothing succeeds like success, and in the age of conquest and commerce, the nation was carried triumphantly onwards on the wave of its own self-confidence. Republican Rome was repeatedly on the verge of extinction in 319 BC, when the Gauls sacked the city, and in 216 BC after the Battle of Cannae, but no disaster could shake the resolution of the early Romans. Yet in the latter stages of the Roman decline, the whole empire was deeply pessimistic, thereby sapping its own resolution. Frivolity is the frequent companion of pessimism. As eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. The resemblance between various declining nations in this respect is truly surprising. The Roman mob, we have seen, demanded free meals and public games. Gladiatorial shows, chariot races, and athletic events were their passion. In the Byzantine Empire, the rivalries of the Greens and the Blues in the Hippodrome attained the importance of a major crisis. Judging by the time and space allotted to them in the press and television, football and baseball are the activities which today chiefly interest the public in Britain and the United States respectively. Oh, he's so not wrong about that. Sports ball just completely dominates the normie mind. And I'll never forget, like 3 years ago, we had this controversy where, like, to do the Football Premier League, where it was like going to be restructured, and so many people like chimped out over it. And it was just so frustrating that, you know, your country has been invaded by foreigners, and your daughters and female relatives are being raped by migrants, and you say nothing, but you chimp out over bloody football.
Yeah. I'm not super familiar with what's everything going on in the UK, but I get a general idea.
I was just giving you an example, and just reminds me of that there's that Stone Toss comic where you've like got the guy, and he's like, he complains about the woke beer, and then suddenly he just completely flips and just starts cheering the Super Bowl that's on. Yeah, many such cases. Yeah, the heroes of declining nations are always the same: the athlete, the singer, or the actor. The word celebrity today is used to designate a comedian or a football player, not a statesman, a general, or a literary genius. Yes, the replacement of William Shakespeare with, people like who's the bloody woman who wrote The Handmaid's Tale? It's
Margaret Atwood. So fun fact, that's actually straight from her. Like, this is literally, it came straight from her. That she actually said it's not a feminist novel. People are totally misinterpreting this.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I thought she was a feminist.
No, I think I think she's well, I mean, not like not in the traditional sense, of course, but like in the modern sense. But I know she's a Tory.
Well, I think that's more of an accurate summation of the state of modern Toryism, for being honest. So,
well, very true.
Okay. 24. The Arab decline. In the first half of the 9th century, Baghdad enjoyed its high noon as the greatest and richest city in the world. In 861, however, the reigning caliph Mutawakkil was murdered by his Turkish mercenaries, who set up a military dictatorship which lasted for some 30 years. During this period, the empire fell apart, the various dominions and provinces each assuming virtual independence and seeking its own interests. Baghdad, lately the capital of a vast empire, found its authority limited to Iraq alone. The works of the contemporary historians of Baghdad in the early 10th century are still available. They deeply deplored the degeneracy of the times in which they lived, emphasizing particularly the indifference to religion, the increasing materialism, and the laxity of sexual morals. They lamented also the corruption of the officials of the government and the fact that politicians always seemed to amass large fortunes while they were in office. The historians commented bitterly on the extraordinary influence acquired by popular singers over young people, resulting in a decline in sexual morality. The pop singers of Baghdad accompanied by their erotic songs on the lute, an instrument resembling the modern guitar. In the second half of the 10th century, as a result, much obscene sexual language came increasingly into use, such as would not have been tolerated in an earlier age. Several caliphs issued orders banning pop singers from the capital, but within a few years they always returned. I have to wonder what the medieval Arab equivalent of "My milkshake brings all the boys to the yard" would have been.
It's funny. I feel like he clearly had like the Beatles in mind and the Rolling Stones when he was writing this. But I feel like if he were alive today, he'd be like, yeah, there's no classical music, but like still way better than Cardi B.
Yeah, true.
Like I think like at least in the like music of the 60s and 70s, the quote unquote pop music he's referring to, there's at least artistic merit to that. Whereas like now it's just gotten even worse.
Yeah, like I know I'd agree that pop music has certainly declined. Like the average reading age of popular music has declined significantly.
It's like everyone's so obsessed with like going to Taylor Swift concerts and all that stuff. And it's like, I went to a Roger Waters concert about 2 years ago or so in DC. And I mean, there were a lot of people there, but it's like, this is a way better experience than like what I'd imagine a Taylor Swift concert to be.
And it also explains why the boomers just like won't go away, because though we can criticize them, the boomers were probably one of the last generations to make probably consistently good music.
Absolutely.
Well, perhaps Gen X, but
no, I was about to say Gen X, yeah, to a lesser extent, but I mean, still, even then, like 90s music was not consistently good.
No, I mean, there's probably some of it, but not all of it.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, comment. Nami El Kazan. Almost 50 years have passed since this article was written, and yet it feels like it was written yesterday. Yeah, that was my exact thoughts when I first read this a couple of years ago.
Yep. Same.
Yeah, it could have been any one of us writing this. Okay. Sorry, where was I? Okay, here we go. And increasing the influence of women in public life has often been associated with national decline. The later Romans complained that although Rome ruled the world, women ruled Rome. In the 10th century, a similar tendency was observable in the Arab Empire, the women demanding admission to the professions hitherto monopolized by men. What, wrote the contemporary historian Ibn Bassam, have the professions of clerk, tax collector, or preacher to do with women? These occupations have always been limited to men alone. Many women practice law, while others obtain posts as university professors. There was an agitation for the appointment of female judges, which, however, does not appear to have succeeded. Soon after this period, government and public order collapsed, and foreign invaders overran the country. The resulting increase in confusion and violence made it unsafe for women to move unescorted in the streets, with the result that the feminist movement collapsed. The disorders following the military takeover in 861 and the loss of the empire had played havoc with the economy. At such a moment, it might have been expected that everyone would redouble their efforts to save the country from bankruptcy, but nothing of the kind occurred. Instead, at this moment of declining trade and financial stringency, the people of Baghdad introduced a 5-day week. When I reread these contemporary descriptions of 10th century Baghdad, I could scarcely believe my eyes. I told myself that this must be a joke. The descriptions might have been taken out of the Times today. And it's just amazing, isn't it, that we react to Glub the same way Glub reacted to medieval Arab texts.
How much of this is actually, because I'm a little skeptical of, I mean, of course, I know that women did achieve some positions of power in the later Arab Caliphate, but how much of that is he overstating? Because I have a hard time to believe that the role of women in the Caliphate was anywhere near as prevalent as it is now in the modern United States, or just Western countries in general.
The thing is, I don't know. I'll probably have to read a lot of these Arab scholars he's drawing from, because it sounds like a lot of primary material he's leaning on. And in the secondary material I've read, I've not seen anything like this. The closest I can think of, if we're talking about the Middle East, is there was that period in the Ottoman Empire.
I was thinking the Ottomans might be yeah.
You had the harem, the Sultanate of Women, as it was called. Right.
It's totally random, but my fiance and I were watching Aladdin the other night,
Okay.
and I was like the Disney version, and I'm like, how is this succession going to work? Because I know, like, I mean, the princess in Aladdin could not have been the heir, yet they kind of make her out to be the heir. I'm like, that's not how it works. And it's like supposed to be medieval Baghdad.
Mm. Well, what I would say, I mean, if she's the only daughter, then I guess, but I mean, it begs the question: did the Sultan have any nephews or brothers? Because they probably would have been the natural successors in that situation. But that's besides the point. I think we're getting a bit beside ourselves. So, no, that's an interesting point to consider for another topic at some point. Right, hang on. Okay. Yes, the resemblance of all the details was especially breathtaking. The breakup of the empire, the abandonment of sexual morality, the pop singers with their guitars, the entry of women into the professions, the 5-day week. I have not ventured to attempt an explanation. There are so many mysteries about human life which are far beyond our comprehension. Okay. 25. Political ideology. Today, we attach immense importance to the ideology of our internal politics. The press and the public media in the USA and Britain pour incessant scorn on any country, the political institutions of which differ in any manner from our own idea of democracy. It is therefore interesting to note that the life expectation of a great nation does not appear to be in any way affected by the nature of its institutions. Past empires show almost every possible variation of political system, but all go through the same procedure from the age of pioneers through conquest, commerce, affluence to decline and collapse. Then you've got the Mamluk Empire. The empire of the Mamluks of Egypt provides a case in point, for it was one of the most exotic ever to be recorded in history. It is also exceptional that it began on one fixed day and ended on another, leaving no doubt of its precise duration, which was 267 years. In the first part of the 13th century, Egypt and Syria were ruled by the Ayyubid sultans, the descendants of the family of Saladin. Their army consisted of Mamluks, slaves imported as boys from the steppes and trained as professional soldiers. On the 1st of May 1250, the Mamluks mutinied, murdered Turan Shah, the Ayyubid sultan, and became the rulers of his empire. The first 50 years of the Mamluk Empire were marked by desperate fighting with the hitherto invincible Mongols, the descendants of Genghis Khan, who invaded Syria. By defeating the Mongols and driving them out of Syria, the Mamluks saved the Mediterranean from the terrible fate which had overtaken Persia. In 1291, the Mamluks captured Acre and put an end to the Crusades. From 1309 to 1341, the Mamluk Empire was everywhere victorious and possessed the finest army in the world. For the ensuing 100 years, the wealth of the Mamluk Empire was fabulous, slowly leading to luxury, the relaxation of discipline, and to decline, with ever more bitter internal political rivalries. Finally, the empire collapsed in 1517 as a result of the military defeat by the Ottomans. The Mamluk government appears to us utterly illogical and fantastic. The ruling class was entirely recruited from young boys born in what is now southern Russia. Every one of them was enlisted as a private soldier. Even the sultans had begun life as private soldiers and had risen from the ranks. Yet, this extraordinary political system resulted in an empire which passed through all the normal stages of conquest, commercialism, affluence, and decline, and which lasted approximately the usual period of time. The master race. The people of the great nations of the past seem normally to have imagined that their preeminence would last forever. Rome appeared to its citizens to be destined to be for all time the mistress of the world. The Abbasid caliphs of Baghdad declared that God had appointed them to rule mankind until the day of judgment. 70 years ago, many people in Britain believed that the empire would endure forever. Although Hitler failed to achieve his objective, he declared that Germany would rule the world for 1,000 years. That sentiments like these could be publicly expressed without evoking derision, so that in all ages the regular rise and fall of great nations has passed unperceived. The simplest statistics prove the steady rotation of one nation after another at regular intervals. The belief that their nation would rule the world forever naturally encouraged the citizens of the leading nation of any period to attribute their preeminence to hereditary virtues. They carried in their blood, they believed, qualities which constituted them a race of supermen, an illusion which inclined them to the employment of cheap foreign labour or slaves, to perform menial tasks and to engage foreign mercenaries to fight their battles or to sail their ships. These poor peoples were only too happy to migrate to the wealthy cities of the empire, and thereby, as we have seen, to adulterate the close-knit, homogeneous character of the conquering race. The latter unconsciously assumed that they would always be the leaders of mankind, relaxed their energies, and spent an increasing part of their time in leisure, amusement, or sport. In recent years, the idea spread widely in the West that progress will be automatic without effort, that everyone will continue to grow richer and richer, and that every year will show a rise in the standard of living. We have not drawn from history the obvious conclusion that material success is a result of courage, endurance, and hard work. A conclusion nevertheless obvious from the history of the meteoric rise of our own ancestors. The self-assurance of its own superiority seems to go hand in hand with the luxury resulting from wealth in undermining the character of the dominant race. No, certainly once you have the fall of the dominant race, it's where everything goes to pot. The welfare state. When the welfare state was first introduced in Britain, it was hailed as a new high water mark in the development of history of human development. History, however, seems to suggest that the age of decline as a great nation is often the period which shows a tendency to philanthropy and to sympathy for other races. This phase may not be contradictory to the feeling described in the previous paragraph, that the dominant race has the right to rule the world, for the citizens of the great nation enjoy the role of Lady Bountiful. As long as it retains the status of leadership, the imperial people are glad to be generous, even if slightly condescending. The rights of citizenship are generously bestowed on every race, and even those formerly subject, and the equality of mankind is proclaimed. The Roman Empire passed through this phase when equal citizenship was thrown open to all peoples, such provincials even becoming senators and emperors. The Arab Empire of Baghdad was equally, perhaps even more generous. During the Age of Conquest, purebred Arabs had constituted a ruling class, but in the 9th century, the empire was completely cosmopolitan. State assistance to the young and the poor was equally generous. University students received government grants to cover their expenses while they were receiving higher education. The state likewise offered free medical treatment to the poor. The first free public hospital was opened in Baghdad in the reign of Harun al-Rashid, and under his son Mamun, free public hospitals sprang up all over Arab world from Spain to what is now Pakistan. The impression that will always be automatically rich causes the declining empire to spend lavishly on its own benevolence until such time as the economy collapses, the universities are closed, and the hospitals fall into ruin. It may be perhaps be incorrect to picture the welfare state as the high watermark of human attainment. It may merely prove to be one or more regular milestone in the life story of an aging and decrepit empire. No, certainly, because where he was talking about, you've got the bread and circuses in ancient Rome, the gibs, so to speak, are always a sign of that your society is in decline, because essentially you're just trying to buy off the masses as your loyalty so they don't revolt against you.
And I'd say our equivalent of bread and circuses is like all the slop you see on TV these days, even more than like modern sports. I'd say it's mostly like all the slop you see on TV. And even like presidential debates and stuff, which at this point only exist for entertainment purposes, which are not useful at all.
No, certainly. It's like the Jerry Springer shows of the world.
Yes.
And also, in Britain's case,
even more recently, what was that one? Was it like MILF Island or like a MILF Manor or something?
Oh,
which it's like,
oh my god!
Oh, which is like, it was like 8 women and 8 younger guys, and the catch is like one of the women is each of their moms.
Oh wow!
It's like why?
There's a show in Britain which I can't remember the name of, and it's like, I think it's called Naked Attraction, and it's literally like people being introduced to each other for the first time, like start naked, and I'm just like, this is obscene. Why is this on television?
It's ridiculous.
Yeah, and then the masses have to consume their slop, so we're stuck with it. Right.
And a lot of this entertainment is like purely subsidized now. And to a lesser extent, I know it wasn't particularly popular, but I know when we were on Yiz's stream a few weeks ago, there was that one segment on that video game that was funded by like Norwegian tax dollars.
Oh yeah, that bloody,
what was it? The Dustborn or whatever it was called.
The Dustborn, yeah. Oh.
Like I part of me is still like, part of me wonders if that actually is like a psyop and it was a parody the whole time. But like, I don't know.
Oh, it gets worse. Have you seen that Tales of the Shire game they're making?
The what?
Tales of the Shire.
The Hobbit one?
Yeah. Oh my god. The video literally had like a pink-haired like feminist in it.
That's strange. If it weren't for that, like other than that, it kind of looks like a cute little game, but like I don't trust them to make it any good.
No, it looks deeply subversive. I just can't help. It's like the Shire, but you're putting this like revolting 21st century like shit lib veneer over it.
It's insane.
What's this? Those type of shows make you wish for a nuclear apocalypse.
Agreed.
Yeah,
100%.
yeah, agreed. Mm-mm.
Sometimes I
Nuclear
hear like
winter.
sometimes I live in the DC area, so sometimes I see like jets flying outside and like military helicopters. I'm like, yes, is it happening? Is it finally happening? But unfortunately, it does not.
I don't know. Perhaps a nuclear winter will make the hard times create strong men come true.
Yeah.
Religion. Historians of periods of decadence often refer to a decline in religion, but if we extend our investigation over periods covering the Assyrians to our own times, we have to interpret religion in a very broad sense. Some such definition as the human feeling that there is something, some invisible power, apart from material objects which control human life and the natural world. We are probably too narrow and contemptuous in our interpretation of idol worship. The people of ancient civilizations were as sensible as we are, and would scarcely have been so foolish as to worship sticks and stones fashioned by their own hands. The idol was for them merely a symbol. It represented an unknown spiritual reality that controlled the lives of men and demanded human obedience to its moral precepts. We all know only too well that minor differences in human visualization of this spirit frequently became the ostensible reason for human wars, in which both sides claimed to be fighting for the true God. But the absurd narrowness of human conception should not blind us to the fact that very often both sides believed their campaigns to have moral backgrounds. Genghis Khan, one of the most brutal of all conquerors, claimed that God had delegated him the duty to exterminate the decadent races of the civilized world. Thus, the age of conquest often had some kind of religious atmosphere, which implies heroic self-sacrifice for the cause. It's funny, I can't help but read this, but think of like the Butlerian Jihad in like June or something.
Yeah.
It's like, we're going to come in, we're going to conquer this old decrepit empire and establish a new one. Billions must die.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, but this spirit of dedication was slowly eroded in the age of commerce by the action of money. People make money for themselves, not for their country. For themselves, not for their country. Thus, periods of affluence gradually dissolved the spirit of service, which had caused the rise of the imperial races. In due course, selfishness permeated the community, the coherence of which was weakened until disintegration was threatened. Then, as we have seen, came the period of pessimism with the accompanying spirit of frivolity and sensual indulgence. By products of despair, it was inevitable at such times that men should look back yearningly to the days of religion, when the spirit of self-sacrifice was still strong enough to make men ready to give and to serve rather than to snatch. It's interesting, isn't it, that he talks about pessimism being a sign of decline, but it just shows you like the prophets of doom, people like Spengler, they are pessimists. Optimism is cowardice. Only during times such as these that such men emerge. But while despair might permeate the greater part of the nation, others achieved a new realization of the fact that only readiness for self-sacrifice could enable a community to survive. Some of the greatest saints in history lived in times of national decadence, raising the banner of duty and service against the flood of depravity and despair. In this manner, at the height of vice and frivolity, the seeds of religious revival are quietly sown. After perhaps several generations or even centuries of suffering, the impoverished nation has been purged of its selfishness and its love of money. Religion regained its sway, and a new era sets in. It is good for me that I have been afflicted, said the psalmist, that I might learn thy statutes. New combinations. We have traced the rise of an obscure race to fame, those stages of conquest, commercialism, affluence, and intellectualism, to disintegration, decadence, and despair. We suggested that the dominant race at any given time imparts its leading characteristics to the world around, being in due course succeeded by another empire. By this means, we speculated many successive races succeeded one another as superpowers, and in turn bequeathed their peculiar quantities to mankind at large. But the objection may here be raised that someday the time will come when all the races of the world will in turn have enjoyed their period of domination and have collapsed again in decadence. When the whole human race has reached a stage of decadence, where will new energetic conquering races be found? The answer is at first partially obscured by our modern habit of dividing the human race into nations, which we seem to regard as watertight compartments, and irresponsible for innumerable misunderstandings. In earlier times, warlike nomadic nations invaded the territories of decadent peoples and settled there. In due course, they intermarried with the local population, and a new race resulted, though it sometimes retained an old name. Barbarian invasions of the Roman Empire probably provide the example best known today in the West. Others were the Arab conquest of Spain, North Africa, and Persia, the Turkish conquest of the Ottoman Empire, or even the Norman conquest of England. In such cases, the conquered countries were originally fully inhabited and invaders were armies, which ultimately settled down and married to produce new races. In our times, there are few nomadic conquerors left in the world who could invade more settled countries, bring in their tents and flocks with them, but ease of travel has resulted in an equal or probably an even greater intermixture of populations. The extreme bitterness of modern internal political struggles produces a constant flow of migrants from their native countries to others, where the social institutions suit them better. The vicissitudes of trade and business similarly result in many persons moving to other countries, at first intending to return, but ultimately settling down in their new countries. The population of Britain has been constantly changing, particularly in the last 60 years, owing to the influx of immigrants from Europe, Asia, and Africa, and the exit of British citizens to the Dominions and the United States. The latter is, of course, the most obvious example of the constant rise of new nations and of the transformation of the ethnic content of old nations through modern nomadism. Yeah, I think we're coming up to the final stretch now. Yeah, there's only a few pages left. So, yeah, the decadence of a system. It is of interest to note that decadence is the disintegration of a system, not of its individual members. The habits of the members of the community have been corrupted by the enjoyment of too much money and too much power for too long a period. The result has been, in the framework of their national life, to make them selfish and idle. A community of selfish and idle people declines, internal quarrels develop in the division of its dwindling wealth, and pessimism follows, which some of them endeavour to drown in sensuality or frivolity. In their own surroundings, they are unable to redirect their thoughts and their energies into new channels. But when individual members of such a society immigrate into entirely new surroundings, they do not remain conspicuously decadent, pessimistic, or immoral among the inhabitants of their new homeland. Once they're able to break away from their old channels of thought, and after a short period of readjustment, they become normal citizens of their adopted countries. Some of them, in the second and third generations, may attain preeminence and leadership in their new communities. This seems to prove that the decline of any nation does not undermine the energies or the basic character of its members, nor does the decadence of a number of such nations permanently impoverish the human race. Decadence is both mental and moral deterioration, and produced by the slow decline of the community from which its members cannot escape, as long as they remain in their old surroundings. But transported elsewhere, they soon discard their decadent ways of thought and prove themselves equal to the other citizens of their adopted country. Decadence is not physical. Neither is decadence physical. The citizens of nations in decline are sometimes described as too physically emasculated to be able to bear hardship or make great efforts. This does not seem to be a true picture. Citizens of great nations in decadence are normally physically larger and stronger than those of the barbarian invaders. Moreover, as was proved in Britain in the First World War, young men brought up in luxury and wealth found little difficulty in accustoming themselves to life in the frontline trenches. The history of exploration proves the same point. Men accustomed to comfortable living in homes in Europe or America were able to show as much endurance as the natives in riding camels across the desert or in hacking their way through tropical forests. Decadence is a moral and spiritual disease, resulting from too long a period of wealth and power, producing cynicism, decline of religion, pessimism, and frivolity. The citizens of such a nation will no longer make an effort to save themselves, because they are not convinced that anything in life is worth saving. I'm going to push back on him a bit, because I would argue that decadence does have a physical manifestation, and largely in how a lot of people, especially in the West, have become dysgenic.
Mm-hmm.
Largely, I think that was the World Wars, where, if you think about it, all the high quality men died in those wars. And obviously that then creates a bottleneck or systemic push onto the future generations.
So yeah, I really like that last quote, that decadence is a moral and spiritual disease. That's probably one of his more famous quotes from this.
Well, no, he's absolutely spot on. Okay, next we've got a human diversity. Generalizations are always dangerous. Human beings are all different. The variety in human life is endless. If this be the case with individuals, it is much more to do with nations and cultures. No two societies, no two people, no two cultures are exactly the same. In these circumstances, it would be easy for critics to find many objections to what has been said and to point out exceptions to the generalizations. There's some value in comparing the lives of nations to those of individuals. No two persons in the world are identical. Moreover, their lives are often affected by accidents or by illness, making the divergences even more obvious. Yet, in fact, we can generalize about human life in many different aspects. The characteristics of childhood, adolescence, youth, middle, and old age are well known. Some adolescents, it is true, are prematurely wise and serious. Some persons in middle age still seem to be young, but such exceptions do not invalidate the general character of human life from the cradle to the grave. I venture to submit that the lives of nations follow a similar pattern. Superficially, all seem to be completely different. Some years ago, a suggestion was submitted to a certain television corporation that a series of talks on Arab history would form an interesting sequence. The proposal was immediately vetoed by the director of programs with the remark, "What earthly interest could the history of the medieval Arabs have for the general public today?" Yet, in fact, the history of the Arab imperial age, from conquest through commercialism to affluence, intellectualism, science, and decadence, is an exact precursor of British imperial history and lasted almost exactly the same time. British historians a century ago had devoted serious study to the Arab Empire. They could have foreseen almost everything that's of course happened to Britain down to 1976. A variety of falls. It's been shown that normally the rise and fall of the great nations are due to internal reasons alone. 10 generations of human beings suffice to transform the hardy and enterprising pioneer into the captured citizen of the welfare state. But whereas the life histories of great nations show unexpected uniformity, the nature of their falls depends largely on outside circumstances and thus shows a high degree of diversity. The Roman Republic, as we have seen, was followed by the Empire, which became a super-state in which all the natives of the Mediterranean basin, regardless of race, possessed equal rights. The name of Rome, originally a city-state, passed from it to an equalitarian international empire. This empire broke in half, the western half being overrun by northern barbarians, the eastern half forming the East Roman or Byzantine Empire. The vast Arab Empire broke up in the 9th century into many fragments, of which one former colony, Muslim Spain, ran its own 250-year course as an independent empire. The homelands of Syria and Iraq, however, were conquered by successive waves of Turks, to whom they remained subject for 1,000 years. The Mamluk Empire of Egypt and Syria, on the other hand, was conquered in one campaign by the Ottomans, the native population merely suffering a change of masters. The Spanish Empire, 1500 to 1750, endured the full conventional 250 years, terminated only by the loss of its colonies. The homeland of Spain fell, indeed, from its high state of a superpower, but remains as an independent nation until today. Romanov Russia, 1682 to 1916, ran the normal course, but was succeeded by the Soviet Union. It is unnecessary to label the point, which we may attempt to summarize briefly. Any regime which attains great power, wealth and power seems with remarkable regularity to decay and fall apart in some 10 generations. The ultimate fate of its component parts, however, does not depend on its internal nature, but on the other organizations which appear at the time of its collapse and succeed in devouring its heritage. Thus, the lives of great powers are surprisingly uniform, but the results of their falls are completely diverse. A thought I've had, I just want your opinion on, is obviously he's got this idea of the Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union as a successor empire, which didn't last the full course. However, we now have Russia post the Soviet collapse, and though this Russia is obviously not as strong or as powerful as the Russian Empire of old, I can't help but feel it is somehow some new empire, because I do see a little bit of the age of pioneers and the age of conquests in modern Russia, though obviously it's not quite as strong as the original Russian Empire, because if you look at Putin, you've got the Russia today wants to try and, sees itself as an empire. It wants to dominate. It wants to influence, especially if you look at something like the war in Ukraine or some of the other minor conflicts Russia has gotten itself involved with, such as the Russo-Georgia War in 2008. What are your thoughts on that?
I'd say it could go either way. You could also, alternatively, to play the devil's advocate, you could argue that the Russian Federation is actually more of a successor to, or not a successor. It's not a separate entity, but actually a continuation of the Soviet Union. Especially when you consider that, like, the elite, it's the same elite that was in control of the USSR, but they just realized that communism is no longer a viable force in order to continue competing with the West. Because, a lot of the leader, like the oligarchs, for instance, are either the children of or are themselves former Soviet ministers. And then when they privatized all of these formerly nationalized industries, they privatized them, divided them up, and just handed them to these oligarchs. So,
I know, I suppose that's a
There's
fair
kind of a
point.
struggle right now between the oligarchs, the kingmakers, and people like Putin, the actual government that's in power. Like there's essentially like they want to control him, and at the same time he wants to assert himself before them. So yeah, I mean it could go either way. You could say that I used to be more partial to the idea that it is a new emergent power, but honestly I can't see Russia as a singular sustainable state after Putin, which is why I think that a Russia with Putin is definitely more preferable to a Russia without Putin, because there's definitely, after Putin dies, unless he chooses a leader who's as, I guess, strong as he is, I think it could potentially balkanize.
Yeah, that is possible. So, no, I think that's interesting. I mean, if we're looking at the Soviet Union and modern Russian Republic, it's almost a bit like Rome's changed from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire in a way, or perhaps the Principate to the Dominate.
Yeah, and I'd say that's more the Principate to the Dominate is, I think, a more apt comparison. But you can also argue that right now Ukraine versus Russia, it's kind of a civil war if you think about it. Like, yes, Ukraine is a separate state, but like in theory, but in practice, it kind of resembles more of a civil war.
Here's another thought I've just had. The Soviet Union is was the Roman Empire, and Russia is the Byzantine Empire, and the war in Ukraine is like Justinian's Renovatio imperial restoration,
or like or maybe something closer to like the crisis of the 3rd century. You have Putin, you have Zelensky, you had the Wagner Battalion or whatever it was called at one point. But yeah, like Zelensky and Putin are essentially warlords.
It also makes me think of 20th century China after the declaration of the Republic, and you have the warlord era.
Yeah.
Yeah. But perhaps Putin is some like Russian Chiang Kai-shek, and perhaps I don't know, Ukraine represents like a Slavic Manchuria or something.
I can see that.
Right. Well, let's carry on, because we're on the home stretch. So, inadequacy of our historical studies. In fact, the modern nations of the West have derived only limited value from their historical studies, because they've never made them big enough for history to have meaning. As we've already stated, it must be the history of the human race. Far from achieving such an ideal, our historical studies are largely limited to the history of our own country during the lifetime of the present nation. Thus, the time factor is too short to allow the longer rhythms of the rise and fall of nations even to be noticed. As the television director indicated, it never even crosses our minds that longer periods could be of any interest. When we read up the history of our own nation, we find the actions of our ancestors described as glorious, while those of our other peoples are depicted as mean, tyrannical, or cowardly. Thus, our history is intentionally not based on facts. We are emotionally unwilling to accept that our forebears might have been mean or cowardly. Alternatively, there are political schools of history started to discredit the actions of our past leaders in order to support modern political movements. In all these cases, history is not an attempt to ascertain the truth, but a system of propaganda devoted to the furtherance of modern projects or the gratification of national vanity. Men can scarcely be blamed for not learning from the history they are taught. There is nothing to learn from it because it is not true. Small nations. The word empires has been used in this essay to signify nations which achieve the status of great powers, or superpowers in the jargon of today, nations which have been dominated the international scene for 2 or 3 centuries. At any given time, however, there are also smaller states which are more or less self-contained. Do these live the same lives as the great nations and pass through the same phases? It seems impossible to generalize on this issue. In general, decadence is the outcome of too long a period of wealth and power. If a small country is not shared in the wealth and power, it will not share in the decadence. The emerging pattern, in spite of the endless variety and the infinite complications of human life, a general pattern does seem to emerge from these considerations. It reveals many successive empires covering some 3,000 years as having followed similar stages of development and decline, and as having, to a surprising degree, lived lives of very similar length. The life expectation of a great nation, it appears, commences with a violent and usually unforeseen outburst of energy, ends in a lowering of moral standards, cynicism, pessimism, and frivolity. If the present writer were a millionaire, he would try to establish in some university or other a department dedicated solely to the study of the rhythm of the rise and fall of powerful nations throughout the world. That'd be amazing if we could set up something like that. We'd have like a Globe scholarship dedicated to like proper history teaching.
Yeah.
Perhaps one day. History goes back only some 3,000 years, because before that period, writing was not sufficiently widespread to allow of the survival of detailed records. But within that period, the number of empires available for study is very great. At the commencement of this essay, names of 11 such empires were listed, but these included only the Middle East and the modern nations of West. India, China, and Southern America were not included, because the writer knows nothing about them. A school founded to study the rise and fall of empires would probably find at least 24 great powers available for dissection and analysis. The task would not be an easy one. If indeed the net was cast so wide as to cover virtually all the world's great nations in 3,000 years, the knowledge of language alone, to enable detailed investigations to be pursued, would present a formidable obstacle. Would it help? It is pleasing to imagine that from such studies, a regular life pattern of nations would emerge, including an analysis of the various changes which ultimately lead to decline, decadence, and collapse. It is tempting to assume that measures could be adopted to forestall the disastrous effects of excessive wealth and power, and thence of subsequent decadence. Perhaps some means could be devised to prevent the activist age of conquest and commerce deteriorating into the age of intellect, producing endless talking but no action. It is tempting to think so. Perhaps if the passion of the rise and fall of nations were regularly taught in schools, the general public would come to realise the truth and would support policies to maintain the spirit of duty and self-sacrifice, and to forestall the accumulation of excessive wealth by one nation, leading to the demoralisation of that nation. Will not the sense of duty and the initiative needed to give rise to action be retained parallel with intellectual development and discoveries of natural science? The answer is doubtful, though we could but try. The weakness of human nature, however, are so obvious that we cannot be too confident of success. Men bursting with courage, energy, and self-confidence cannot easily be restrained from subduing their neighbours, and men who see the prospect of wealth open to them will not readily be prevented from pursuing it. Perhaps it is not in the real interest of humanity that they should be so prevented, for it is in the periods of wealth that art, architecture, music, science, and literature make the greatest progress. Moreover, as we have seen, where great empires are concerned, the establishment may give rise to wars and tragedies, but their periods of power often bring peace, security, and prosperity to vast areas of territory. Our knowledge and our experience, perhaps our basic human intellects, are inadequate to pronounce whether or not the rise and fall of the great nations is the best system for the best of all possible worlds. These doubts, however, need not prevent us from attempting to acquire more knowledge of the rise and fall of great powers, or from endeavouring, in the light of such knowledge, to improve the moral quality of human life. Perhaps, in fact, we may reach the conclusion that the successive rise and fall of the great nations is inevitable and indeed a system divinely ordained, but even this would be an immense gain, for we should know where we stand in relation to our human brothers and sisters. In our present state of mental chaos on the subject, we divide ourselves into nations, parties, or communities, and fight, hate, and vilify one another over developments which may perhaps be divinely ordained, and which seem to us, if we take a broader view, completely uncontrollable and inevitable. If we could accept these great movements as beyond our control, there would be no excuse for our hating one another because of them. However varied, confusing, and contradictory the religious history of the world may appear, the noblest and most spiritual of devotees of all religions seems to reach the conclusion that love is the key to human life. Any expansion of our knowledge which may lead to a reduction in our unjustified hates is therefore surely well worthwhile. So I think that's an interesting passage, and something I actually want to say, where he talks about culture there. One part of his analysis is that Glubb does seem to focus heavily on military conquest and commerce and industry and material factors.
As
He doesn't
opposed
really
to culture.
Yes, because Arnold Toynbee and Spengler both, though they both have their differences, they both heavily rely a lot on culture in both their analyses.
And Spengler, though he did talk about political developments, it was a much smaller focus compared to the more the cultural aspects. And I know it was a second volume of Decline of the West. The second half of that was dedicated mostly to political developments, but it unlike Toynbee, who I guess focused on it a little more. It was. I would have liked to see Spengler talk more about politics, and I know he does in some of his other essays, but he didn't really apply them as much to his Decline of the West thesis.
No, he certainly didn't. And so, okay, I've got the summary. So, as numerous points of interest have arisen in the course of this essay, I close with a brief summary to refresh the reader's mind. We do not learn from history because our studies are brief and prejudiced. In a surprising manner, 250 years emerges as the average length of national greatness. This average has not varied for 3,000 years. Those represent 10 generations. The stages of rise and fall of great nations seems to be the age of pioneers, the age of conquests, the age of commerce, the age of affluence, the age of intellect, the age of decadence. Decadence is marked by defensiveness, pessimism, materialism, frivolity, an influx of foreigners, the welfare state, a weakening of religion. Decadence is due to too long a period of wealth and power, selflessness, love for money, loss of a sense of duty. The life histories of great states are amazingly similar, and are due to internal factors. The falls are diverse because they are largely the result of external causes. History should be taught as the history of the human race, though of course with emphasis on the history of the student's own country. Oh, and that's the end of it. So, well, we've been going for over 2.5 hours. Is there any final comments you want to make on the article?
Not particularly. However, I would be open to doing a follow-up just to talk more about it, broadly speaking.
Oh no, certainly I'd be open to doing that, and we could even bring in some of Glubb's other ideas that he explores in his other books. So, yeah, but thank you for coming on, Politicrat. So
Yeah, absolutely.
just to provide my own conclusion, I think this is a very solid article. It's got some weaknesses here and there, like not really talking about culture, and also some of the dating on his empires is a bit wonky. But other than that, I think it's a good work in its own right, and it's best viewed as a good introduction to the topic of cyclical history. And once you read this, please go on to read Toynbee, Spengler, Vico, and many other of the cyclical historians.
That's a good one too.
I've not read Vico yet, but I do have a copy of the New Science, which I need to get around to at some point.
Yeah, a great book.
Okay, so anything you would like to share before we get out of here?
I have my YouTube channel. I'm sure you put it in I don't know if you put it in the show notes or not, but
I linked from your Twitter, but I'll put your YouTube there as well.
Oh yeah, follow me on Shitter. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. I hope to start making content again soon, but it remains to be seen how soon soon is. So,
well, I look forward to when you do. So in terms of this channel, tomorrow I'm rejoined by my friend Hunger the Dye Merchant. We will be.
Oh, I love Hunger.
Yeah, we'll be carrying on our series on the Chatterhouse version of essays by Eli Kaduri. We'll be looking at pan-Arabism and how that relates to British policy in the Middle East. So thank you, everybody, for watching. So I'll see you all tomorrow. Good night.
Good night.